It begins in silence. Not the kind you find in a library or a polite dinner table, but the ancient, all-consuming quiet of a world without machines, without cities, without even a name for time. Somewhere in that silence, long before the first stone of Egypt was set, before the first cuneiform mark in Sumer, human hands were already performing a ritual no historian can fully name. A circle drawn in the dirt, a chant repeated under a pale moon, a figure painted in ochre on a cave wall, part animal, part something else. The archaeologists will tell you it's symbolic expression, a sort of evolutionary milestone. The anthropologists prefer proto-religion, a label that sounds academic enough to keep things tidy, but both terms are too polite. Whatever this was, it wasn't tidy. It was blood and bone and sky and stone, and it left traces everywhere, even in places where no one should have been able to leave a mark. We're talking about a faith older than civilization itself, a system of belief that predated writing, agriculture and cities, so old it didn't even have gods the way we think of them now. No Zeus with a beard, no Anubis with a jackal's head, just forces, presences, eyes in the dark that might belong to a spirit, or a bear, or something in between. The oldest clue isn't a scroll, or a statue, or even a ruin. It's a red handprint on a cave wall in El Castillo, Spain. It was pressed there over 40,000 years ago. The paint is still faintly visible, fingers spread wide, the thumb bent slightly in. Whoever made it wasn't leaving a signature, they were opening a doorway. A continent away, in Sulawesi, Indonesia, another set of hands, quite possibly from the same time period, left similar marks, alongside paintings of animals that no longer roam the earth. And in the gaps between these sites, in the caves of France, in the rock shelters of Australia, in the petroglyph fields of the American Southwest, the same pattern emerges, humans going to great trouble to make art in places where no one lived. If you're thinking, why not just draw it outside where there's more light? Congratulations, you're thinking like a 21st century person. For them, the deep cave was the point. The darkness was part of the journey. These were not casual doodles. They were acts, performances, offerings. Some researchers believe the echoing chambers, the flicker of firelight, and the sound of chanting would have altered the mind. In other words, these were proto-temples, and the walls themselves were the altar. Fast forward a few thousand years and you find more deliberate signs of what we might dare to call worship. At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, the world's oldest known temple complex, great T-shaped pillars rise from the earth, carved with animals, abstract shapes and, disturbingly, headless human figures. Dated to around 9600 BCE, this site existed before agriculture, before pottery, before the wheel. Whoever built it for a purpose other than survival. And then, in an act that still baffles researchers, they buried it deliberately under tons of earth, as if hiding it from whoever came next. The uncomfortable truth for historians is this. By the time the first official civilizations appeared in Mesopotamia, Egypt and the Indus Valley, humans had already been practicing some form of structured symbolic ritual for tens of thousands of years. And yet we don't know its name, its myths, or even its exact object of devotion. All we have are the fingerprints, quite literally, and the monumental hints left in stone. It is tempting to see this as the seed from which all later religions grew. But the evidence suggests something more unsettling. It might not have been the seed at all. It might have been a whole forest, now cut down to a few scattered stumps. Civilizations that came later didn't evolve from it. They replaced it. And like most victors, they erased the memory of what came before. The irony? We may still be practicing pieces of it without realizing it. The bonfire you dance around on midsummer's night. The way you pause when the full moon rises. The unexplainable urge to stack stones on a hike. These little reflexes, repeated over generations, are the crumbs of a feast long eaten. So we stand in a peculiar position, holding fragments of a religion older than all recorded history, trying to piece together a worldview that existed before language could even record it. We can't summon its hymns or recite its prayers, but we can walk where its followers walked, touch the stones they carved, and feel the chill of the same caves they entered with torches and trembling anticipation. And maybe, just maybe, if we look at the right angle, we can see it. The shadow of a faith that was never meant to be written down, only lived. The first religion, the nameless one, the one older than the pyramids, older than the gods, older than civilization itself. The trouble with finding the world's first religion is that it didn't leave behind tidy scriptures or neatly labeled altars. There are no instruction manuals buried in the sand, no temple guest books with signatures in ancient ink. What we have instead are crumbs, scattered artifacts, odd arrangements of bones, inexplicable carvings that seem to have been made for no practical reason. Take the caves of Chauvet in southern France. Discovered in 1994 and sealed for over 30,000 years, they contain paintings so vivid they look like they were finished last week. Lions stalk bison across the stone, rhinos clash horns in a frozen battle, and in the flicker of torchlight the animals seem to move. It is tempting to call this art, but art for whom? These caves weren't living spaces. People didn't lounge here with a prehistoric glass of wine, admiring the decor, the depth, the isolation, the deliberate journey into darkness. It all suggests ceremony. Nearby, in the Gravettian burial sites of Dolní Věstonice in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists have found human remains dusted with red ochre and surrounded by ivory beads. This was 26,000 years ago, long before the pyramids, long before anyone thought to stack bricks into a ziggurat. The dead here weren't simply disposed of. They were prepared, decorated, sent off with a kind of care that speaks to belief. And then there are the Venus figurines, small, rounded carvings of women, found from Siberia to Spain, all dating to roughly the same period. The oldest Venus of Holotheniids, the oldest Venus of Holophils, is over 35,000 years old. She is faceless, but her hips and breasts are exaggerated, her body carved in a way that leaves no doubt what she represents: fertility, abundance, life itself. You can hold her in the palm of your hand, which makes you wonder, did she travel in someone's pouch as a charm? Was she set on a stone during childbirth? Or was she part of a whispered ritual, passed from one pair of hands to another under the light of a fire? These are not the trappings of survival. No one needs to carve a fertility figure to catch a rabbit. No one spends hours painting rhinos in the dark because it's the most efficient way to pass the time. Something deeper was at work, a compulsion to mark, to honor, to interact with forces unseen. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, we go even further back, 75,000 years. Here, etched into pieces of ochre, are cross-hatched patterns that defy explanation. They're not pictures of animals. They're not maps. They are deliberate, repeated symbols, scratched into stone by people whose names will never be known. Some archaeologists argue these marks are the earliest evidence of symbolic thought, and by extension, the earliest evidence of belief. But the real curveball comes from places like the Shigir Idol in Russia's rural mountains. Standing over 5 meters tall when first erected, carved from larch wood more than 11,000 years ago, it is the oldest known wooden sculpture in the world. Its surface is covered in geometric designs and human-like faces, stacked one above the other, like a totem pole that predates the concept of totem poles. No one knows what it meant, but the repetition, the precision, the sheer effort to make and preserve it suggest it was more than decoration. All of these finds have one thing in common. They exist in a space between utility and mystery. They serve no clear practical function, yet they demanded time, skill, and collaboration. And when prehistoric people spent resources on something, it was never by accident. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scholars roll their eyes at the idea of a lost religion. They argue these were isolated traditions, coincidentally similar but unconnected, just parallel human responses to the same basic needs. But then you look at the sheer scale of distribution. The Venus figurines alone turn up from France to Siberia, carved across a span of thousands of years by people who had no cities, no shared language, no postal service, and yet somehow shared an artistic vocabulary. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. And then there's the curious case of deliberate placement. In megalithic sites like Nabta Playa in Egypt's Nubian desert, stone circles align with solstices and star positions. These were constructed around 7,000 years ago, long before Stonehenge. The builders were nomadic cattle herders, not farmers tied to a plot of land, yet they carried heavy slabs across the desert to place them with astronomical precision. Why? To mark the seasons? To honor the sky? Or to reenact a story we no longer know? The more of these hints you gather, the harder it is to believe they are random. The cave art, the figurines, the burial rites, the astronomical monuments, they feel like parts of a single unspoken system. A religion without a name, without a founder, without a holy book, but with a reach so vast it makes the later empires look parochial. And here's the kicker. The deeper we dig, the older it gets. Every decade or so, a new discovery pushes the timeline further back, as if history itself is playing a game of keep away. We thought complex ritual began 5,000 years ago, Try 10,000, or 30,000, or maybe, and this is the part that makes even the boldest archaeologists squirm, maybe it never began at all. Maybe it was simply part of being human, as natural as language or laughter. Whatever it was, it left just enough behind to make us certain it existed, and just little enough to keep us guessing. Which, if this was indeed a religion, might have been the point all along. After all, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be carried, like a charm, from one generation to the next. If you strip religion down to its bones, what you're left with is ritual, the repeated act, the pattern that gives shape to meaning. And if you go far enough back, before there were temples or altars or even villages, you find those patterns forming in the simplest, strangest places. Imagine a group of hunter-gatherers huddled around a fire, somewhere on the steppe 25,000 years ago. The air smells of smoke and animal fat. The elders speak in low tones, their hands moving as much as their lips. The child watches as a figure, the shaman, though they don't have that word yet, steps into the light. Around their neck hangs a necklace of teeth. Their face is smeared with ochre. In one hand a carved bone, in the other a bundle of dried herbs. There's no liturgy here, no written prayer to follow. What happens next will be a mix of performance and instinct. The shaman shakes the herbs until they rattle, traces a shape in the air, and mutters words that are half language, half sound. The others lean in, not because they think a miracle will happen, but because they've learnt that when the ritual is done, the hunt goes better, the sick recover, the sky clears. Cause and effect? Maybe. But in a world where survival is balanced on a knife edge, you don't argue with what works. Over time, these acts start to repeat. The same chant before a hunt, the same path taken to a burial site, the same way of placing stones around a fire. What began as an improvisation becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes law. You don't skip it because we've always done it this way. A phrase that in prehistoric terms could mean for the last 100 generations. Some of the earliest evidence of such repeated acts comes from burial sites like Sunjir in Russia, dating back 34,000 years. There, two children were laid to rest side by side, their tiny bodies covered with thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, and spears carved from mammoth tusk. It would have taken hundreds of hours to prepare these grave goods. This wasn't just disposal of the dead, it was a statement, a performance for the living and whatever waited beyond. We also see ritual in the way people arranged their spaces. In Dolní Věstonice, mammoth bones were stacked into structures that were part shelter, part shrine. Hearths were placed in specific spots, not just for warmth but as a kind of center. The fire as a living thing that demanded feeding and respect. Archaeologists have found that these hearths often contained unusual objects. Animal skulls, pigment stones, even carved figurines. It's hard not to see them as offerings. The same impulse appears in rock art. In the caves of Altamira, Spain, handprints and animal figures are layered over one another in a way that suggests generations returning to the same spot to refresh the images. Think of it as prehistoric graffiti, not because they were bored teenagers with nothing to do, but because returning to mark the same wall kept a connection alive. And then there's the use of sound. In the cave complex of Historiets in France, researchers found ancient flutes made from bird bones, some dating back over 20,000 years. These instruments weren't for background music while you sharpened your spear. They were likely part of ceremonies, their eerie tones echoing in chambers where flickering firelight made the painted animals seem to move. If you've ever heard a bone flute played in a cave, you know how quickly it turns the air electric. Of course, rituals didn't have to be solemn. Some were playful, theatrical even. Imagine a midsummer gathering where the tribe paints their bodies, dances in circles, and tells stories through gesture and chant. The point wasn't entertainment, it was participation. To be part of the pattern was to be part of the group, and to be part of the group was to be safe. One fascinating example of this comes from the site of Lepenski Vrn, along the Danube in Serbia. Around 9,000 years ago, the people here built trapezoid-shaped houses that all faced the same way toward the river. Inside they placed carved stone sculptures, part human, part fish. Some believe these figures represented river spirits, guardians of the community's lifeblood. The layout suggests more than just practicality. It suggests choreography, the entire village oriented toward a sacred stage. Ritual in these earliest days was as much about place as it was about act. Certain stones, certain trees, certain bends in a river became charged by repetition. The more a place was visited for ceremony, the more sacred it became. It's a feedback loop that still exists today. Think of pilgrimage sites where the act of going is as important as what happens when you arrive. And here's the thing about ritual. It survives even when the original meaning is lost. You can strip away the myth, forget the language, change the clothing, and the gesture still lingers. Anthropologists call this cultural residue. A medieval harvest feast might be the faint echo of a Neolithic solstice rite, which in turn could be the fossil of something Paleolithic. So when we talk about the birth of ritual, we're not talking about a moment in history when someone invented religion. We're talking about an unbroken chain of acts, stretching back into the Ice Age and forward into the present. Each link in that chain was hammered out in the dark by firelight, in places that smelled of earth and smoke and human breath. And while we can't hear their prayers or see the world through their eyes, we can at least say this: whatever they believed it together. And that, in a world where a bad season could kill you, might have been the most sacred act of all. If you were to draw a timeline of human history, it would look something like this. For tens of thousands of years we hunt, we gather, we wander. Then almost suddenly we settle down, plant crops, build villages, and eventually cities. Religion, we've been told, comes after all that. The farmers build the temples. The priests appear once there's surplus grain to feed them. Göbekli Tepe throws that story into the shredder. Perched on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, the site doesn't look like much at first glance. A few rings of stone half buried in the earth. The kind of place you'd drive past on your way to somewhere more important. But when Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist, began digging here in the mid-1990s, he realized what he had stumbled on was not just old, it was older than anything anyone had dared to imagine. Radiocarbon dating put the earliest layers at around 9600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. For context, that's before the wheel, before writing, before pottery, and crucially before agriculture. Whoever built Göbekli Tepe was still living the hunter-gatherer life. They had no permanent villages, no domesticated animals apart from a few dogs, and yet they were capable of organizing the manpower, skill and vision to carve and raise multi-ton stone pillars in complex, carefully arranged circles. Each pillar stands between 3 and 6 meters tall, shaped like a giant T, flat-top, vertical shaft. Carved into their surfaces are animals in vivid relief. Foxes mid-stride, vultures with outstretched wings, snakes, wild boars, even spiders. Some are so finely detailed you can see muscle definition in the limbs. Others are abstract symbols, crescents, circles, H shapes whose meanings are anyone's guess. And then there are the human figures. Not the proud, striding men of later empires, but strange, headless forms, sometimes with hands carved in low relief across the front. They seem to be both human and something else, guardians or ancestors or gods, if those words even apply to a belief system this ancient. The layout itself is a masterpiece of planning. The stone circles were cut into bedrock, their pillars arranged in symmetrical patterns, with 2 larger central pillars facing each other in the middle of each enclosure. The space between them feels intentional, almost theatrical. If you stand in the center and imagine the walls finished, the carvings painted, the firelight dancing over animal shapes, it's easy to see how this could have been a stage for something more than daily survival. What exactly happened here? The truth is, no one knows. There's no evidence people lived at the site, no cooking fires, no trash heaps, no domestic debris. It appears to have been purely ceremonial, which is strange because that means people traveled here from who knows how far away, just to participate in whatever took place in those circles. Even stranger, at some point, they deliberately buried it. Not neglected, not abandoned, buried. The enclosures were filled with rubble, sealing the pillars in place like time capsules. Why would anyone do that? Was it to preserve them, to hide them, to mark the end of an era? One theory is that Göbekli Tepe was a meeting point for scattered hunter-gatherer groups, a place to renew alliances, arrange marriages, share resources, and conduct shared rituals. In that sense, it might have been the glue that held far-flung communities together, a spiritual headquarters for a religion with no capital. Another theory flips our assumptions entirely. Maybe the act of building sites like Göbekli Tepe is what led to agriculture, not the other way around. If you have a place where hundreds of people gather regularly, you need a steady food supply to host them. That might have encouraged the first experimental planting, the first attempts at domestication. In other words, the temple didn't grow out of the farm grew out of the temple. For all its mysteries, one thing is clear. Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated fluke. There are other smaller sites in the region with similar pillars and layouts, suggesting a tradition, not a one-off. This wasn't the work of a lone visionary. It was a shared cultural project, one that spanned generations. And it's not just the architecture that speaks to something organized and enduring. It's the craftsmanship. Carving limestone with stone tools is slow, punishing work. Moving multi-ton pillars without wheels or draft animals requires ingenuity, cooperation, and no small amount of stubbornness. This wasn't a weekend project. It was a labor of decades, maybe centuries. What's most unsettling is that Göbekli Tepe predates not only cities but also the myths we think of as ancient. This place was already ancient when the first clay tablets were pressed in Mesopotamia. It was ancient before the first pyramid stone was laid. It is in a sense the ancestor of all temples, and yet it doesn't fit neatly into the family tree. If religion is about creating a bridge between the seen and unseen, Göbekli Tepe feels like a suspension bridge built in the dark, with no blueprint, yet somehow still standing after 12 millennia. And maybe that's why it continues to unsettle archaeologists. It suggests that human spirituality and the urge to monumentalize it isn't the byproduct of civilization. It's the other way around. Standing there today, with the Anatolian sun beating down and the wind whipping across the ridge, you can almost hear it. The low murmur of voices, the scrape of stone on stone, the distant thud of something heavy being dragged uphill. A religion without a name, still echoing in the stones it left behind. Long before humans built cities, they built a relationship with the sky. The sun told them when the days were long or short. But it was the moon that gave them a clock they could actually see moving, waxing, swelling, fading, vanishing. The moon didn't just mark time, it was time. And for the first followers of the lost religion, the moon was as much a living presence as the fire at the center of camp. One of the oldest pieces of evidence for this lunar obsession comes from a site called Warren Field in Scotland. At first glance, it's nothing more than a scatter of ancient pits in the earth. But when archaeologists mapped their alignment, they realized something extraordinary. These pits marked the phases of the moon. Dated to around 8000 BCE, it is the world's oldest known lunar calendar, which means hunter-gatherers in the Mesolithic were already tracking time in a way that went beyond wait until it's warmer to hunt reindeer. If you think about it, the moon was the perfect spiritual anchor for people who moved with the seasons. It was regular but not static. It changed but always came back. It could vanish completely, yet return as if reborn. A nightly reminder that cycles rule the world. Birth, death, and renewal weren't abstract ideas. They were happening overhead every month. In many early cultures, full moons were moments of gathering. Imagine a small band of people who have been scattered across a valley for weeks, each group foraging in different areas. The full moon becomes the night to meet, to exchange news, to trade, to pair off, to perform rituals. You don't need a sundial to tell you it's the right night, the sky announces it. The moon also turned the night into a workable stage. Torches and campfires could only light so much, but a bright full moon turned open ground into a glowing arena. Here, dances could last until dawn, hunters could track game by silver light, shamans could lead initiations without stumbling into a tree, and when the moon was gone, the darkness itself became sacred, a time for whispering, for hiding, for rituals of absence. We see hints of these night practices in the placement of certain megalithic monuments. At Nabta Playa, in what is now Egypt's Nubian desert, stone circles and alignments appear to track not only the sun, but the rising and setting of certain stars, and the phases of the moon. Around 6000 BCE, the people here were herding cattle, digging wells, and dragging massive slabs of sandstone into place, not for shelter, but to mirror the heavens. In Europe, the story repeats. At the site of Calanesh in the Outer Hebrides, tall stones are arranged in a cruciform pattern, with lines that align to lunar extremes, events that only occur every 18.6 years. This isn't the kind of thing you notice by accident. To track such a cycle, someone had to be watching the moon religiously, probably passing the knowledge down through chants, stories, and, if we trust the archaeologists, the occasional night spent standing very still in a windswept field. What's striking is how global this moon watching was. In the Americas, the Chaco Canyon culture would later build great houses, whose windows framed moonrises with eerie precision. In Asia, Neolithic jade discs in China have been interpreted as representations of the moon and sun together, a cosmic pairing long before the written word recorded the concept. But in the deep past, it wasn't just about calendars. The moon was woven into myths that have left faint fingerprints in later religions. Goddesses of the moon appear in Sumer, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, but their roots may stretch back to the nameless women carved into Paleolithic figurines, women whose cycles matched the moon's 29-day rhythm. The connection between fertility and the moon would have been obvious to early humans, perhaps too obvious to bother explaining. There's also the matter of the moon mask, a motif seen in various prehistoric carvings, where a face is shown in profile, crescent-shaped. Some see it as simple art, Others suspect it's a visual reminder of a story now lost, a tale of the moon as a watcher, a judge, or even a participant in human affairs. Night rituals, too, may have had layers we can only guess at. Ethnographic studies of more recent hunter-gatherer societies, the closest models we have for prehistoric life, describe ceremonies where drumming, dancing and chanting continue for hours under the moonlight, creating a trance state shared by the whole group. This could be entertainment, yes, but it could also be transformation, an entire community shifting into a different mode of being for a night, connected by rhythm, light and shadow. And here's a thought to keep you up tonight. The moon doesn't look the same from every point on Earth. For people migrating, seeing a familiar lunar face in a new horizon might have been a comfort, a constant in a shifting world. For those who stayed put, the moon's slow drift over decades could have been a reminder that nothing, not even the sky, stays exactly the same. The lost religion may not have worshipped the moon as a deity in the way later cultures did, but the moon was undeniably part of its ritual backbone. It was a clock, a compass, a calendar, and in a world without streetlights or neon signs, the most reliable light source you could ask for. Some of the oldest surviving ceremonial spaces may have been designed for no other purpose than to honor this celestial metronome. To stand in those places on the right night, with the moon at the right point in its cycle, must have felt like stepping into a conversation that had been going on since the dawn of humanity. And perhaps that conversation never really ended. It just moved into different languages, different symbols, different nights. They turn up in the most unlikely places, buried in loam, tucked into rock crevices, washed from the banks of rivers that haven't seen a human settlement in millennia. They are small enough to fit in a palm, yet heavy with meaning. Some are made of stone, some from ivory, others from baked clay, hardened in the ashes of ancient fires. And although they are separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, they share the same unmistakable form, rounded hips, full breasts, a belly that suggests pregnancy, and often no face at all. We call them Venus figurines, a name coined in the 19th century by European archaeologists with a romantic if slightly tongue-in-cheek nod to the Roman goddess of love. It's a convenient label, though wildly anachronistic. The people who carved these women lived tens of thousands of years before Rome was a twinkle in the Tiber. But the label stuck, and so now these silent figures are catalogued under a name from a civilization that couldn't possibly have imagined them. The oldest of these Venuses, found in the Hohlfels cave in Germany, dates to about 35,000–40,000 years ago, deep into the Upper Paleolithic. She is carved from mammoth ivory, faceless but unmistakably feminine, with proportions exaggerated to the point where arms and legs are mere suggestions. Whoever carved her took pains to etch tiny lines across her torso, perhaps representing clothing, tattoos, or body paint. She's small enough to hang from a cord, and indeed she bears a loop carved at the top. Was she worn around the neck, carried in a pouch, kept close like a talisman? And she is not alone. From the limestone Venus of Willendorf in Austria, with her intricate braided hair or headdress, to the stylized, almost abstract Venus of Lespougy in France, the figures appear across Ice Age Europe in a remarkably consistent style. Even in Siberia, far from the gentle valleys of the Danube, the Malta and Boret figurines show the same broad hips and heavy breasts, sometimes with carefully carved clothing or ornaments. The geographic spread is staggering. These women appear in regions that at the time were separated not by a day's walk but by vast glaciers, mountain ranges, and dangerous migrations. Yet the form, the celebration of the female body in its life-giving fullness, is nearly identical. That's not coincidence. That's a shared language of belief. Of course, archaeologists don't agree on exactly what they meant. Some suggest they were fertility charms, meant to ensure successful childbirth or plentiful game. Others think they might have been teaching tools for midwives or young women, a portable reminder of the female form and its transformations. A more modern theory argues they were symbols of abundance in times of scarcity, carved during harsh winters when a plump, well-fed figure represented survival. And then there's the theory that edges closest to the lost religion we're tracing here, that the Venus figurines represent not just individual women, but a central figure, the mother of all mothers. Not a goddess in the later sense, with temples and hymns, but a primordial archetype, the living earth itself, embodied in human form. The giver of life, the nurturer, the cyclical force that, like the moon, swells, empties, and renews. If that sounds poetic, remember that in a world without agriculture, survival depended directly on the rhythms of nature. Game animals migrated, plants ripened and withered, rivers swelled and shrank. Everything came and went in cycles, and at the heart of it all was the female body, a body that could bleed without dying, swell with life, and bring forth a new human being. If you were looking for the most visible, tangible metaphor for the mysteries of existence, you didn't have to look to the stars. You could look across the fire and see it sitting there, breathing. One intriguing clue to the figurines' role comes from their wear patterns. Many show signs of being handled repeatedly, smoothed surfaces, polished curves where countless thumbs have rubbed. This suggests they weren't buried as offerings immediately, they were used, carried, touched. The act of holding one might have been part of the ritual itself, a way to connect physically to the force it represented. Some figurines were found in what appear to be domestic spaces, others in caves alongside animal carvings and other symbolic art. The variety of context suggests they were not tied to a single ceremony, but were part of daily spiritual life, something integrated into both the mundane and the sacred. It's worth noting that not all Venuses were overtly voluptuous. Some are slender, others are stylized into geometric forms, almost unrecognizable as human. This variation hints that they were more than one-size-fits-all charms. They were interpreted, adapted, and personalized by each community, yet always within the broader symbolic framework. And perhaps that's the real clue. The mother of all mothers was not a fixed portrait. She was a presence that could be carved 100 different ways and still be recognized. Just as the moon has many phases but remains the moon, the archetype could be faceless, braided, tattooed, draped, or bare, and still hold the same meaning. What's especially haunting is how this archetype survived long after the Ice Age ended. In Neolithic figurines, in Bronze Age goddesses, in medieval paintings of the Virgin, you can trace the same lines, the same emphasis on the nurturing body. Civilizations came and went, names changed, myths mutated, but the figure of the life-giving mother remained, a ghost of the lost religion walking through the corridors of later faiths. Today, the Venuses rest in glass cases under controlled lighting, their curves and hollows scrutinized by visitors in museum gift shops. But once, they were warm to the touch, passed from hand to hand under the flicker of firelight. Once they were more than art. They were belief, carried in the pocket of a hunter, hidden in the bundle of a midwife, buried in the earth as an offering to whatever force might be listening. In every human group, there comes a moment when someone is chosen, or perhaps chooses themselves, to walk a path slightly apart from the others, not because they hunt better or gather more berries, but because they seem to see things the rest cannot. Maybe it's the way they dream. Maybe it's the way they can sit still for hours, staring into the fire and then speak of something that hasn't happened yet. In the world of the lost religion, these people became the first spiritual specialists, the shamans. The word shaman comes to us through Siberian languages, but the role itself appears in every early culture. It is one of the few human constants, as universal as fire-making or storytelling. The shaman's job was simple in description, impossible in practice, to mediate between the visible and invisible worlds. Picture a winter night in the Upper Paleolithic. The air outside the shelter is knife-sharp. Inside, the fire is low, and the people are quiet. A man lies feverish under a hide, his breath shallow. The group's shaman, a woman in this case, kneels beside him. She has painted her face with white clay, and in her hair are the feathers of a bird no one hunts for food. She begins to hum, the sound low and unbroken, almost mechanical in its rhythm. In her hands a carved bone rattle. She shakes it in time to the hum, then begins to sway. Others watch, not speaking. This is not medicine in the modern sense, but it is healing, and in this time the two are the same. Evidence of such roles comes to us from burials that stand out from the ordinary. One of the most famous is the Shaman of Troffres in France. A figure painted on the wall of a cave, part man, part stag, part something else entirely. His antlers sweep back, his eyes are wide, his body appears to be in motion. Archaeologists have long debated whether this is a literal depiction of a man in costume, or a vision of a spirit being encountered in trance. Either way, it tells us that there was a recognized role for someone who could cross boundaries. In other places, we find shamans in death, as we suspect they lived in life, surrounded by objects that were not purely utilitarian. In the Czech Republic, a 26,000-year-old burial at Dolní Věstonice contains the remains of an older woman with a deformed spine, buried with ceremonial items. She would not have been a hunter or gatherer in the physical sense, yet she was important enough to be honored in death. Then there's the burial of a man in Sungur, Russia, laid to rest with 3,000 meticulously carved ivory beads, fox teeth and spears. Some think he was a leader. Others suggest a spiritual figure, whose wealth was not measured in meat or hides, but in his role as the group's bridge to the unseen. What did these shamans actually do? Based on ethnographic parallels with later hunter-gatherers, we can guess. They performed healing rituals, interpreted dreams, led seasonal ceremonies, guided the dead to the afterlife, mediated disputes, and advised on hunts. They entered altered states of consciousness through drumming, chanting, fasting, or perhaps the use of natural intoxicants, and returned with messages or visions. Costume played a part too. Animal skins, feathered cloaks, elaborate masks. These weren't just for show. They were tools of transformation, allowing the shaman to become the animal spirit they sought to channel. Archaeologists have found carved masks of bison, bear, and bird forms in sites where shamans are suspected to have worked. Imagine the firelight catching in the eyes of such a mask, the shadows making the figure seem larger, less human. The role was dangerous. If the hunt failed, if illness spread, if weather turned, suspicion could fall on the shaman. They were respected, but also feared. In some cultures, the shaman was forbidden from touching certain foods, crossing certain rivers, or sleeping in the same shelter as others. Power came with isolation. But the shaman was also indispensable. In a world without written calendars, they were the keepers of seasonal memory. The ones who knew when the herds would pass, when the river would flood, when the berries would ripen. In a world without medicine, they were the ones who remembered which root soothed fever, which bark eased pain, which smoke drove insects away. And in a world where the boundary between life and death was thin, they were the ones who could walk up to that line and sometimes bring someone back. Shamanism is one of the strongest threads linking the lost religion to the present. Even today, in isolated parts of Siberia, the Amazon and the Arctic, shamans still perform roles that would be instantly recognizable to their Ice Age counterparts. The chants, the rattles, the belief in animal allies. It's not just similar, it's eerily consistent. Some researchers have even argued that shamanism is the lost religion, that what we call religion in its later organized forms is merely the codified, bureaucratized descendant of an older, more personal, more ecstatic spiritual practice, that the priest in the temple and the monk in the cloister are, in some deep historical sense, the children of the figure in the antlered mask. Whether or not that's true, the evidence suggests that wherever early humans went, the shaman went too. Across the ice, over the steppe, through dense forests, into the desert, always someone willing to risk stepping into the dark to bring back a little light. The desert is the last place you'd expect to find a calendar. Sand is not exactly known for its long-term record-keeping. It moves, it buries, it erases. And yet, in a remote stretch of the Nubian desert in southern Egypt, far from the Nile's lush green banks, a cluster of stones has been standing for thousands of years. Stones placed so deliberately, so precisely, that they have been keeping time since long before the pyramids rose. The site is called Nabta Playa, and during the Holocene wet phase, roughly between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, it was not a barren wasteland, but a seasonal lake surrounded by grasslands. The people who came here were nomadic herders, moving with their cattle to follow the rains. They left no cities, no palaces, no carved obelisks. What they left instead were stones. At first glance, Nabta Playa's stone circles look modest compared to the megalithic grandeur of Stonehenge. The tallest is barely 3 meters, and the circles themselves are small enough to walk around in under a minute. But their importance lies not in size, but in alignment. When archaeologists surveyed them, they realized that certain stones lined up with the sunrise at the summer solstice, while others marked key positions of the moon and specific stars. One grouping appears to track the rising of Orion's belt and Sirius celestial events that thousands of years later would still be celebrated in ancient Egypt. In fact, some researchers believe that Nabta Playa's builders were the cultural ancestors of the first Nile Valley civilizations, bringing with them an already well-developed system of astronomical observation. But astronomy was only part of the picture. Scattered around the site are large stone slabs, some weighing several tons, engraved with images of cattle. The cattle motif repeats again and again, so much so that it's clear these animals were not just dinner, they were sacred. In many early African pastoralist cultures, cattle were a form of currency, status, and spiritual connection. At Nabta Playa, the evidence suggests that herds were central to ritual life. Some of the stones may have been part of ceremonial enclosures for offerings, perhaps the sacrifice of cattle, or symbolic rites to ensure their fertility. There's also the matter of the calendar circle, a small arrangement of upright stones about 4 meters across. At first glance, it seems unremarkable. But when mapped and compared to the sky as it would have appeared 7,000 years ago, the stones align in ways that strongly suggest they were used to track the solar year. This would have been essential for nomadic groups who needed to know when to move before the seasonal rains came. What's fascinating, and a little unsettling, is how early this kind of complex astronomical awareness appears. Nabta Playa predates Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years. It was built by people who had no written language, no metal tools, and no permanent settlements. Yet they could read the heavens with a precision that rivals early city-states. And then there's the layout itself. Beyond the main circle are lines of stones stretching away toward the horizon. Some seem to point to the cardinal directions, others toward specific points where the sun or stars would rise. Walking among them today, you feel less like you're in a ruin, and more like you've stumbled into an enormous sundial, one built not to tell the time of day, but the time of year. Of course, Nabta Playa didn't last forever. Around 5,000 years ago, the climate began to change. The rains grew unreliable, the lake shrank, then vanished. The herders moved on, likely toward the Nile, taking with them their cattle, their stories, and their sky knowledge. The stones remained, half buried in the sand, their alignment still intact for anyone who cared to notice. When archaeologists rediscovered the site in the late 20th century, it caused more than a little discomfort in academic circles. It challenged the assumption that complex religious and astronomical systems could only develop after urbanization. Here was proof that nomadic pastoralists, people we often underestimate as simple wanderers, were capable of building monuments that encoded both spiritual and practical knowledge. Some have even suggested that Nabta Playa was more than a local ritual center, that it was a kind of pilgrimage site for scattered communities across the Sahara. If true, that would place it squarely within the pattern we've been tracing. Sacred gathering places for a religion with no single home, but a shared set of symbols and practices. Standing there today is a strange experience. The desert stretches in all directions, shimmering under a heat that seems intent on erasing memory. And yet, in the middle of this vast emptiness, the stones remain exactly where they were placed 7 millennia ago, still marking the points of sunrise and moonrise as faithfully as they did when the lake was full and the grass grew thick. It's easy to imagine a night here in its prime. The air cooler, the lake reflecting a full moon, the silhouettes of cattle moving in the distance. People gather around the circle, their voices carrying in the dry air. The shaman steps forward, pointing to the horizon where a certain star has just appeared, and everyone nods. It is time. Time to move, to plant, to marry, to begin the rites that will carry them through another cycle. The lost religion was never just about gods or spirits in the abstract. It was about survival, woven into the movements of the sky, the lives of animals, the turning of seasons. And at Nabta Playa, that belief was written not in books but in stone, in a language that could be read only by those who knew how to look up. The strange thing about the world's earliest sacred sites is how far apart they are and how eerily alike. You'd think that groups separated by oceans, mountains, and tens of thousands of miles would develop completely different ways of marking the sacred. And yet again and again the same patterns appear: stone circles, astronomical alignments, animal carvings, and a tendency to choose locations that are impressive to the point of intimidation. Long before maps, these places were known, passed along in stories, encoded in songs, marked by cairns or carvings that pointed the way. In Europe, the stone rings of Britain and Brittany stand as descendants of earlier traditions. In Africa, Nabta Playa's megaliths mirrored the sky. Across the ocean on the Bolivian Altiplano, Tiwanaku's Gate of the Sun, carved thousands of years later, carries echoes of the same impulse, to anchor the heavens to the earth. Even in the far reaches of the Pacific, on islands so small you can walk across them in an hour, you find ancient stone platforms aligned to solstices and equinoxes. Polynesian navigators could read the stars like a book, and their temples, the marae, were as much astronomical observatories as places of worship. It's tempting to call this coincidence. After all, the sun rises and sets in the same places for everyone. But the level of precision in these sites argues against mere accident. Aligning a stone so it marks the solstice sunrise isn't as simple as eyeballing the horizon one morning. It requires watching, measuring, and remembering, often over decades, to account for shifts, to confirm the pattern, to ensure the placement will still be correct generations later. That kind of investment doesn't happen unless the knowledge it encodes is considered vital. And it wasn't just about tracking the sky. The placement of these sites often tied into local geography, in ways that suggest a deeper, perhaps spiritual logic. Many are situated where water meets land, on riverbanks, lake shores, or coastal promontories. Others are built atop hills or ridges, with commanding views in every direction. Still others are placed near caves or springs, places where the boundary between the human world and the underworld or spirit world was thought to be thin. In North America, the ancient earthworks of the Hopewell and Adena cultures some dating back more than 2,000 years, were constructed with geometric precision, often aligned to lunar cycles. Some of these enclosures could only be appreciated from above, suggesting that their builders imagined the gods, spirits or ancestors looking down on them. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines mapped not just the landscape, but the sacred geography of the sky, linking specific stars to landmarks on Earth. Sacred sites along these routes were visited in ceremonial cycles that mirrored the movements of the constellations overhead. Here, the temple was the entire continent, and the rituals were a way of walking through both land and cosmos at the same time. The pattern repeats in Mesoamerica, where Olmec ceremonial centers, Maya pyramids, and Aztec temples all reflect the same underlying principle. The sacred site is a meeting point between the human and the divine, the earth and the sky, the present and eternity. Even the layout of streets and plazas was often dictated by celestial alignments, a tradition that likely traces its roots to far older, now lost sites. What's striking is that many of these places seem to have been used seasonally. They weren't cities in the sense of permanent occupation. Instead, they were destinations, places people traveled to for specific events. Solstices, harvests, initiations, marriages, funerals. This fits the pattern we've seen at Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa, sacred spaces as gathering points for otherwise scattered communities. And there's something else, a kind of family resemblance in the symbols carved into these sites. Spirals, zigzags, animal figures, and anthropomorphic shapes with exaggerated eyes or heads appear in petroglyphs from Ireland to India to the American Southwest. Some archaeologists argue these are universal patterns the human brain tends to produce in altered states, a kind of neurological common ground. If that's true, then perhaps the similarity of sacred sites worldwide isn't just cultural diffusion, but something deeper, the shared wiring of our own minds. Of course, skeptics point out that parallel development doesn't require a single lost religion. People everywhere had to solve the same problems, tracking time, marking territory, creating communal identity. But the sheer persistence of certain patterns across continents and millennia suggests more than pure practicality. There's a feeling that these places were part of a shared conversation, one spoken in stone with words too big to fit into language. We'll likely never know whether there was direct contact between these early builders, or whether their similarities are the result of convergent evolution. But in either case, the effect is the same. A web of sacred sites spanning the globe, each a node in a network older than any empire, older than agriculture, older than writing. Today, we can fly from Stonehenge to Chaco Canyon, to the Moai of Easter Island in the space of a few days, crossing oceans in hours. The people who built them would have taken generations to make the same journey if they could make it at all, and yet in their stones, their alignments, their carvings, it's as if they were all speaking to the same unseen audience. Perhaps they were. If you sail into the central Mediterranean today, past the limestone cliffs of Malta, it's easy to think of it as just another sun-baked island with good beaches and stubborn seagulls. But scattered across this small stretch of land is something far older and far stranger than most visitors ever realize. Here, on a rocky archipelago barely visible on the map, stand some of the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, built by people we know almost nothing about, for reasons we can still only guess. They are the Maltese megalith temples, and they date back as far as 3600 BCE. That's nearly 6,000 years ago, when much of Europe was still thick with forest and cities were only beginning to form in Mesopotamia. And yet on these islands, someone was quarrying enormous limestone blocks, shaping them into smooth curves, and arranging them into vast interconnected chambers that still inspire awe. The most famous is Jarkim, perched on a hill overlooking the sea. Its walls are made from stone slabs so large that even today, with modern machinery, moving them would be a logistical headache. Inside, the rooms are rounded, almost womb-like, with altars and niches cut into the stone. In one chamber, a small window-shaped opening aligns perfectly with the sunrise at the summer solstice, flooding the room with golden light for a brief moment each year. Nearby is Menadra, a complex of 3 temples built side by side, each with its own alignment to the sun. One catches the equinox sunrise, another the solstice, and the third seems to mark the in-between days, a careful division of the solar year that would have been invaluable for agricultural timing. But like Nabta Playa and Göbekli Tepe, these alignments feel as much ceremonial as practical. The light doesn't just enter the temple, it transforms it, turning plain stone into a glowing living space. The interiors of these temples tell another story. Carved spirals, dotted patterns, and plant-like motifs decorate the stones. Some slabs bear tiny drilled holes, forming designs whose purpose is still debated. Were they symbolic maps, counting systems, or purely decorative? And then there are the statues, large stone figures of women, faceless but unmistakably heavy-hipped and full-bodied, echoing the Venus figurines of the Paleolithic. These so-called fat ladies have been found in several temples, often seated as if presiding over the space. The resemblance to earlier mother goddess imagery is hard to ignore. It's tempting to see the Maltese temples as a continuation of that ancient reverence for the life-giving feminine. Except now, the mother is not carved small enough to fit in the hand. She is monumental, seated in stone within a monumental structure, as if the temple itself is her body. Who were the people who built these places? Archaeologists call them the temple culture, but that's really just a placeholder for a civilization we know almost nothing about. They were farmers and herders, growing cereals and pulses, raising goats, pigs and sheep. They had no metal tools, no wheels, no beasts of burden. And yet they managed to quarry, transport and erect blocks weighing up to 50 tons, a feat that makes modern backs ache just thinking about it. They also seem to have been deeply connected to their dead. Some temples have passageways that lead to underground burial chambers, like the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, a sprawling complex carved entirely from limestone, 3 stories deep. Here, thousands of human remains were found, along with red ochre paintings on the walls. The space has a haunting acoustic quality. A voice speaking in certain chambers resonates throughout the complex, as if designed for ritual chanting. The Maltese temple builders flourished for over 1,000 years, creating more than 30 monumental sites across the islands. And then, around 2500 BCE, they vanished. There's no sign of violent conquest, no evidence of a massive natural disaster. The most likely culprit is environmental collapse, deforestation, soil erosion, and overfarming gradually making the islands unable to sustain the population. Whatever the cause, the temples were abandoned, left to be swallowed by earth and time. When the first modern Europeans stumbled upon them in the 16th and 17th centuries, they assumed these ruins were Roman, or maybe even the work of giants. The real story, that they predated both Rome and Egypt, would not be pieced together until the 19th and 20th centuries, and even now many questions remain unanswered. Why here? Why on these tiny islands in the middle of the sea? One theory is that Malta was a stopping point for seafaring peoples traveling between the eastern and western Mediterranean, and that the temples were pilgrimage sites for a broader religious network. Another suggests the islanders themselves developed a unique, insular expression of an older pan-Mediterranean belief system, a localized branch of the lost religion that once spanned continents. Whatever the truth, walking through the shadowy chambers of Gacharkeen or Manadjura today is enough to make you forget the centuries. The air is cool, the light is thin, and the stones seem to hum with a memory they're not quite ready to share. You can imagine the builders moving among them, arranging offerings, watching the first beam of solstice light pierce the darkness, and feeling as countless generations before and after them have felt, that for one brief moment, the human world and the cosmic world touched. If the megalithic temples were humanity's great stone cathedrals, then the painted caves of Ice Age Europe were our chapels, smaller, more intimate, and tucked away in places where only the truly determined could go. They were not built, they were found, claimed, and transformed, and unlike the temples, they seem to have been made for no one's eyes but the initiated few. The first time modern humans stumbled into one of these prehistoric galleries, they didn't quite believe what they saw. In 1940, 4 teenagers chasing a dog in southwestern France found themselves inside the cave of Lascaux. When their torchlight swept across the walls, the boys froze. Horses, stags and bison galloped across the stone, their forms painted with such skill that the muscles seemed to ripple. The colors, black from charcoal, red and yellow from ochre, were still vivid after 17,000 years. Lascaux isn't unique. In 1994, the Chauvet Cave was discovered, sealed off for over 30,000 years. Here, the art is even older, and astonishingly sophisticated. Lions prowl in profile, woolly rhinos clash, and in one haunting panel, a half-human, half-animal figure stands with outstretched arms. The compositions are not haphazard, they are deliberate, layered, and placed where the curves of the rock enhance the illusion of movement. But perhaps the most curious thing about these caves is where the paintings are located. They're not near the entrances where sunlight can reach. They are deep inside, often requiring crawling through narrow passages, climbing down shafts and navigating total darkness. This was not art for casual viewing. It was an ordeal to get here, an ordeal that was probably part of the point. Why go to such trouble? The standard explanation is hunting magic. that by painting an animal, early humans could somehow influence the success of the hunt. But this theory feels too small for the effort involved. Many of the animals depicted, like lions and rhinos, were not hunted at all. Others are shown wounded or in strange poses that don't match everyday observation. It's as if the cave walls were less a hunting manual and more a spirit world, populated with beings both familiar and uncanny. Archaeologists have noticed that many caves with paintings also have unusual acoustics. Certain chambers amplify sound dramatically, a spoken word echoes like a shout, a drum beat rolls through the darkness. It's easy to imagine how this could turn a painting session into a multi-sensory ritual, the flicker of torchlight making the animals seem to move, the echoes creating a sense of unseen presences, the smell of smoke and pigment thick in the air. Some sites, like the Cave of El Castillo in Spain, push the timeline of symbolic art even further back. Here, alongside animal figures, you find simple red discs and stenciled handprints dated to at least 40,000 years ago. These may be the work of early modern humans, or possibly even Neanderthals, which if true means the lost religion was not just ours, but shared with another human species entirely. One of the most striking symbols in these caves is the human hand. Sometimes they are positive prints, made by pressing a painted palm to the wall. More often they are negatives, created by blowing pigment around a hand held against the stone. The effect is ghostly, a presence made visible by its absence. Were these signatures marks of participation in a rite, or something like a passport stamp, proof that you had passed through to another realm? Cave art isn't limited to Europe. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, hand stencils and painted animals date back more than 40,000 years, as old as their European counterparts. In Australia, Aboriginal rock art stretches across tens of thousands of years, depicting not just animals but spirit beings tied to creation stories still told today. The parallels are uncanny. Across continents, separated by oceans and millennia, humans sought out hidden spaces, filled them with images, and treated them as places apart from ordinary life. The cave became a portal, not just a hole in the ground, but a threshold between worlds. It's worth noting that later religious traditions often kept this impulse alive. Think of the hermit caves of early Christian monks, the sacred grottos in Hindu and Buddhist sites, the underground catacombs of Rome. Even when the architecture changed, the idea that the sacred might be found underground, in darkness, in echo, in stone, never really left us. If the megaliths were public rituals in broad daylight, the painted caves were private ceremonies in the depths. The same lost religion might have encompassed both, the gathering of the many and the initiation of the few. We will never know exactly what words were spoken in those chambers, or what stories the paintings illustrated, but we can stand in their footprints, run our fingers over the same stone, and feel that we too have entered a place where the ordinary rules no longer apply. And maybe that was the point all along. If there's one habit that separates humans from the rest of the animal kingdom, it's what we do with our dead. Animals mourn. Yes, elephants have been seen touching the bones of their kin, and chimpanzees will sit by a fallen companion. But humans take it further. We don't just leave the body where it lies. We prepare it. We arrange it. We send it somewhere. Some of the earliest evidence for this comes from the site of Kofse in Israel, where burials dating back about 100,000 years show deliberate placement of bodies, sometimes alongside deer antlers or other symbolic objects. These are not accidental burials, they are acts, which means that even at this remote point in our history, we were already imagining that death was not the end. By the Upper Paleolithic, around 30,000 years ago, burial rituals had become elaborate. At Sungar, in what is now Russia, 2 children were buried side by side, dressed in garments adorned with thousands of ivory beads. Each bead would have taken an hour to carve, an investment of time so huge it's almost impossible to imagine, especially for a community that lived hand-to-mouth in the Ice Age. These children were also buried with long spears carved from mammoth tusk, far too large for them to have ever used. These were not tools, they were symbols. In other sites, bodies are found dusted with red ochre, a pigment that, when fresh, looks like blood. This practice appears from Africa to Europe to Australia, spanning tens of thousands of years. Was the ochre meant to give the dead a lifelike appearance, to symbolize rebirth? Or was it simply the color of power, marking the deceased as someone important in both worlds? We don't know, but the persistence of the custom suggests it was more than decoration. There are also cases where the grave goods speak to a sense of continuity between life and death. In Dolní Věstonice, a woman was buried with the remains of a fox, possibly her hunting companion, as if to join her on the journey. In other places, tools, ornaments, and food are placed with the body, practical supplies for wherever the spirit is going next. The positioning of the bodies varies, but is rarely random. Some are laid out straight, others curled in a fetal position, as if returning to the womb of the earth. In some burials, multiple bodies are arranged together, suggesting family or clan ties that extended beyond death. One particularly haunting find comes from Brno, Czech Republic, where a man was buried with a carved bone staff topped with the head of a bird. His grave was unusually large and well furnished, leading some to believe he was a shaman, perhaps someone expected to keep working his craft in the next world. These burials tell us two important things. First, that humans were willing to devote immense time and resources to the dead, time and resources that could have been spent on the living. Second, that they imagined a reality beyond the visible one. You don't bury someone with a spear unless you think they might need it. You don't dress them in beads unless you think there's someone or something out there who will see them. In many ways, burial sites were the first permanent sacred places. While the living moved with the seasons, the dead stayed put, their graves becoming landmarks, memory anchors in a shifting landscape. Over time, these places may have become pilgrimage points, places where the living return to honor the ancestors, to seek guidance, or to renew their connection to the land. And this connection between the dead and the living didn't end with burial. In some prehistoric cultures, bones of the deceased were exhumed and kept for a time, perhaps as relics or for use in rituals. Skulls might be decorated or displayed in the Levant. Plastered skulls with painted features have been found dating back 9,000 years. These were not macabre trophies, they were preserved presences, ways of keeping the ancestors close. It's worth noting that this care for the dead appears in every corner of the world where we find early humans. From the highlands of Papua New Guinea to the tundra of Siberia, the instinct to mark death with ceremony seems hardwired, which raises an interesting question. Was the belief in an afterlife part of the lost religion from the very beginning, or did it emerge naturally in all human groups as a way to make sense of grief? Perhaps it's both. If the lost religion had a central principle, it may have been that life is cyclical, a series of returns. Just as the moon vanishes and reappears, just as the seasons die and are reborn, so too might the human spirit. And burial rituals were a way of ensuring that the transition was smooth, that the traveler had what they needed for the road. Today we still echo these ancient gestures, placing flowers on graves, tucking mementos into coffins, building monuments to hold the names of the dead. We don't think of these acts as religious in the old sense, but they are. They are the last surviving fragments of a system of belief that began long before anyone carved the first temple stone. The graves of our ancestors are not just holes in the ground. They are the earliest chapters in a story we're still telling, whether we realize it or not. Long before the first stone was carved into a pillar, long before the first wall was painted with horses, there was sound, voice, breath, rhythm. These were the earliest tools of worship, and unlike temples or statues, they left no trace in the soil. What survives are the instruments, and even those are few, fragile relics of bone, shell, and wood that somehow avoided decay long enough for us to find them. One of the oldest known instruments is the bone flute from the Hochleifels cave in Germany, carved from the hollow wing bone of a griffon vulture and dating to about 40,000 years ago. It has 5 finger holes precisely drilled, and when played it produces a scale that still sounds eerily familiar to modern ears. Another, from Geisenklosterhalle cave, is made from mammoth ivory, a material so tough that carving it into a playable flute would have taken extraordinary patience. It's tempting to imagine these flutes as simple entertainment, the campfire music of their day, but their locations tell a different story. Many were found deep in caves alongside paintings and symbolic carvings. The acoustics of these spaces, the way sound echoes and rolls, would have transformed a simple melody into something otherworldly. A note from a bone flute in the darkness would seem to hang in the air, circling the listener like a presence. In the painted caves of France and Spain, researchers have discovered that the most heavily decorated chambers often coincide with spots of unusual acoustics, certain frequencies amplified, others dampened. Drumming, stamping, or chanting in these places would create a physical sensation in the body, a vibration felt as much as heard. For early humans, this would have been indistinguishable from magic. Sound wasn't just made, it was shaped. Percussion instruments, stones, logs, stretched hides, could be used to create steady rhythms, the kind that seem to sync with the heartbeat. In many later cultures, such rhythms are used to induce trance states, a practice that may well go back to the dawn of ritual itself. The steady beat would help shamans or participants cross over into a heightened state of awareness, ready to encounter spirits or ancestors. Even the human voice, unaccompanied, was a powerful instrument. A chant, repeated over hours, in a circle of people swaying together in firelight, could alter perception, slow breathing, and dissolve the sense of time. Words weren't always necessary. Syllables and tones could carry meaning on their own, bypassing language and going straight to the body. There is evidence that sound and movement were inseparable in these early rituals. Footprints found alongside ancient rock art in Australia suggest dancing, with repeated steps worn into the ground. In some cases, pigment from painted walls appears to have been scuffed onto the floor, as if bodies brushed against the rock in rhythm. The ritual space was alive with motion as well as sound. And sound could mark the sacred even without melody. In certain environments, canyons, valleys, cave mouths, a single shout or clap can echo again and again. Some early sites seem deliberately chosen for this effect. Imagine a leader calling out a phrase, and the earth itself answering back as if the spirits were speaking in return. This interplay of sound and space wasn't just for spectacle. It created an experience that was communal and immersive, binding participants together. In a small band of hunter-gatherers where survival depended on trust and cooperation, such shared experiences could strengthen social bonds as effectively as any treaty or leader's command. Archaeologists have also found evidence of sounding stones, natural rock formations that ring or hum when struck. In parts of Africa, Australia and the Americas, such stones are still used in traditional ceremonies. Their sound is deep, resonant, and strangely metallic, as if the earth itself were singing. It's not hard to imagine the awe this would have inspired in prehistoric listeners. There is a theory, and it's an enticing one, that the lost religion didn't have scripture because it didn't need it. Its teachings were carried in sound, in melodies, rhythms, and chants that could be remembered and passed on without writing. In this way, belief could travel light, crossing continents in the heads of nomads, unchanged by distance or time. Even today, fragments of this ancient soundscape survive. The frame drum in shamanic traditions, the didgeridoo in Aboriginal Australia, the throat singing of Siberia and Mongolia, all echo the same principles: repetition, resonance, and a connection between sound and the unseen. It's worth remembering that in a world without engines, without machines, without the constant hum of artificial noise, sound carried a different weight. It could travel miles on still air, or vanish entirely in the muffling snow. A sudden drumbeat in the night would not be background. It would be an event, a signal that something was happening, something important enough to summon the tribe from their shelters into the shared space of ritual. And when the ritual ended, the echoes might linger, fading into the night, leaving the participants with the sensation that the presence they had called was still nearby, listening. In that sense, the lost religion may have been less about objects and places than about moments, moments made unforgettable by sound. The stones of Göbekli Tepe may crumble, the paintings of Lascaux may fade, but a single note from a bone flute played in the right place at the right time could still open the same door it did 40,000 years ago. Before maps, before borders, before the concept of home meant a fixed address. The world was a circuit. People moved because the animals moved, because the rivers swelled or shrank, because the berries ripened and then were gone. Migration wasn't an event, it was the rhythm of life. And tied to this rhythm were gatherings that were as predictable as the seasons themselves, the festivals of the lost religion. These were not festivals in the modern sense. No printed programs, no stalls selling honey cakes. They were gatherings of necessity, freighted with meaning. When 100 people who had spent months scattered across valleys and plains came together, it was a rare and powerful thing. Stories were exchanged, alliances renewed, marriages arranged, disputes settled. But alongside all this practical business was ceremony, and it is here that we see the fingerprints of belief. The evidence for these seasonal gatherings comes from sites like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, where certain rooms appear to have been used for feasts on a scale far larger than daily life required. In other places, like the mammoth bone houses of Eastern Europe, seasonal camps show signs of intense short-term occupation, with layers of ash from massive fires and refuse from communal meals. These were not just big dinners, they were events marked by ritual and performance. Animal remains tell part of the story. At some sites, large numbers of a single species, reindeer in the north, bison on the plains, are found butchered in ways that suggest simultaneous killing. This points to coordinated hunts, likely timed for when herds were at their peak. The kill itself may have been preceded or followed by rituals to honor the animals and ensure their return the following year. Seasonal festivals may also explain the placement of some early monuments. Stonehenge, for example, aligns with both the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset, 2 points in the year that would have been natural gathering times. Though Stonehenge is far younger than the religion we're tracing, it may preserve a pattern that stretches back deep into prehistory, the meeting of scattered groups at key solar moments. In the Arctic, Inuit traditions preserve the memory of such gatherings, with entire communities traveling to a central location when conditions allowed, to feast, sing, and compete in games. In the Australian desert, Aboriginal songlines often converged at certain sites during seasonal festivals, where ceremonies reinforced social and spiritual ties. These examples, though more recent, give us a glimpse of what such events might have looked like in the deep past. Imagine a river valley thousands of years ago. The air is warm, the days are long, and the herds have returned. From the hills and forests, people begin to arrive, family groups, each carrying what they have to trade, what they have to offer. At the center of the gathering place stands a stone circle or a sacred tree. Its significance remembered in songs. Fires are lit, drums begin to beat, and the smell of roasting meat drifts through the camp. The days are filled with practical work, repairing tools, arranging marriages, negotiating grazing rights. But as the sun lowers, the practical gives way to the ceremonial. Dancers step into the open space, their bodies painted with ochre and ash, moving in time to a rhythm that seems older than memory. The shaman begins a chant, calling on the spirits of the land, the sky, the ancestors. Children watch from the edges, imprinting the pattern into their minds. Such festivals were more than social glue. They were opportunities to reinforce the shared cosmology of the group. Myths were retold, often dramatized in dance or story, ensuring that everyone from the oldest elder to the youngest child knew the tales that explained the world. In the absence of writing, these performances were the archive of belief, the living library of the lost religion. Seasonal migrations also created a kind of sacred geography. Certain paths were traveled year after year, generation after generation, until they became more than just routes. They were ceremonial journeys. Specific landmarks along the way might be honored with offerings: a carved rock, a painted cliff face, a tree with strips of cloth tied to its branches. These places became part of the mythic landscape, remembered in stories as the dwelling places of spirits or the sites of ancestral deeds. We can see hints of this in the distribution of prehistoric rock art, which often appears along known migration routes. In some cases, layers of art in the same location suggest that the site was visited and revisited over centuries, each generation adding its own marks. The fact that these locations were often difficult to reach reinforces the idea that the journey itself was as important as the destination. And while we tend to think of migration as movement toward survival, it was also movement toward meaning. The return to a sacred site each year reaffirmed the group's connection to the land, to the seasons, and to each other. It reminded them that they were part of something larger than their own small family band, a network of kin, allies, and shared stories stretching across the landscape. When the festival ended, people would break camp and disperse once more, carrying with them not just the goods they had traded or the alliances they had renewed, but the memory of the ceremonies, the songs still in their ears, the smell of smoke still clinging to their hair. These intangible things were as valuable as any tool or ornament. In a sense, the lost religion may have been most alive in these moments, not in permanent temples or static shrines, but in the movement of people toward each other, in the deliberate convergence of paths under the turning sky. If the lost religion had a written language, it wasn't made of letters. It was made of shapes, carved, painted, and scratched into stone, bone, and clay. These shapes weren't words, but they spoke. You can still see them today, staring out from the walls of caves, the faces of megaliths, and the surfaces of objects that once sat in firelit rooms. Spirals, coiled snakes, radiating circles, symbols so simple that a child could draw them, yet so persistent that they appear on every continent, across tens of thousands of years. The spiral may be the oldest of them all. At first glance, it's just a line curling in on itself. But the more you look, the more it seems to move. It pulls you inward and outward at the same time, like a path and a whirlpool in one. Spirals appear on the stones of Newgrange in Ireland, carved more than 5,000 years ago, and in petroglyphs in the American Southwest, chipped into desert rock by cultures long vanished. They're painted in Paleolithic caves, scratched onto bones, even woven into basketry. Why the spiral? It's the shape of shells, whirlpools, and storms. It's the path of a hawk riding a thermal, the curling of a fern, the shape you see when water drains. To ancient eyes, It was the visible signature of movement and growth, a reminder that the world was always in motion, never fixed. Some archaeologists think spirals marked cycles, the turning of seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon. Others suggest they were portals, drawn to signify a crossing between worlds. Then there's the serpent, another universal. In the oldest carvings, the snake is rarely just an animal. It's often exaggerated, stylized, turned into a ribbon of scales that winds across stone. In Australian rock art, rainbow serpents slither through creation stories. In the Americas, the feathered serpent appears in cultures separated by centuries and geography. In Africa, the python is still revered in some traditions as an ancestral spirit. The appeal of the serpent is obvious. It sheds its skin, emerging renewed, and thus becomes a living symbol of rebirth. It moves without legs, silent and swift, appearing and disappearing almost magically. In the context of the lost religion, it may have represented life's hidden currents, the forces that move beneath the surface. Some serpent carvings even seem to follow astronomical events, like the famous Serpent Mound in Ohio, whose curves align with the summer solstice sunset. And then there's the sun. Not just as a glowing circle, but as a motif radiating lines. From the petroglyphs of Chaco Canyon to the carvings of Malta, sunbursts appear again and again, often in places aligned to solar events. In a world without electric light, the sun was life itself, the ultimate timekeeper. Marking its position wasn't just symbolic, it was survival. But the sun's image also carried deeper meaning: warmth, power, renewal, and the unblinking eye of the sky. What's remarkable is how often these symbols appear together. A stone might bear a spiral beside a snake, or a sunburst surrounded by winding lines. Were they part of a code? A kind of prehistoric shorthand for complex ideas? It's hard not to see them as a shared vocabulary of the sacred, a language that didn't require translation. Some scholars argue these recurring motifs are the product of human neurology, that in altered states the brain tends to produce certain geometric patterns which are then incorporated into art. If true, this means the lost religion's symbols weren't just culturally shared, they were wired into us. The same trance that a shaman in Ice Age France might have entered could produce visions not unlike those of a healer in ancient Australia, both returning to carve what they had seen. But there's another possibility, that these shapes were taught, passed along migration routes like heirlooms. A spiral carved into a rock could be a sign to travelers. Here is a sacred place. A serpent painted on a cliff could mark a spring, a place of renewal. The sun carved into a stone circle could signal that this was where the year's turning was honored. At Newgrange, the Great Passage tomb built around 3200 BCE. Triple spirals are carved on the entrance stone and inside the inner chamber. Once a year, at the winter solstice, the rising sun's light shoots down the passage to illuminate the carvings. The combination of symbol and celestial event is too precise to be coincidence. This was knowledge made permanent in stone, a calendar, a ceremony, and a cosmic alignment all bound together. Even when the meanings of these symbols were forgotten, their shapes endured. They were easy to draw, easy to remember, and endlessly adaptable. Later civilizations would absorb them without realizing their origins. The spiral would become decorative, the serpent a mythic villain or guardian, the sunburst a royal emblem. Stripped of their original context, they would survive as ghosts, aesthetic echoes of the lost religion. Today we can walk into a museum, stand before a slab carved with a spiral 5,000 years ago, and recognize it instantly. We may not know what it meant to the hands that carved it, but we feel its pull all the same. That's the strange power of these ancient symbols. They still work, they still speak, even if the language they once belonged to has been lost for millennia. For tens of thousands of years, human life had been a long, slow migration, following herds, foraging for plants, returning to sacred sites in their seasons. The lost religion thrived in this rhythm because it matched the world around it. Nothing permanent, everything in cycles. But then, around 10,000 years ago, in a handful of fertile valleys, something shifted. People stopped moving. In the Levant, seeds from wild grasses were planted deliberately and tended. In the hills of Anatolia, sheep and goats were kept in pens. Along the Yellow River in China, millet fields appeared. In Mesoamerica, maize was coaxed from its wild ancestor, teosinte. The Neolithic Revolution had begun, and with it came a profound transformation in the way humans understood their place in the world. At first, agriculture must have seemed like magic in its own right. Scatter seeds here, return weeks later, and the ground gives you food. But the magic was fragile. Too little rain, and the crops failed. Too much and they rotted. Insects, blight, and unexpected frosts could ruin everything. Suddenly, survival hinged on the success of one plot of land instead of the vast variety the old hunter-gatherer routes provided. This new dependence changed the old religion's focus. Where once the sacred calendar had been tied to the movements of animals or the cycles of wild plants, now it revolved around planting and harvest. The moon and sun were still important, but their significance narrowed to the specific moments when crops went into the ground or came out of it. Seasonal festivals shifted to match the agricultural year. Sacred sites changed too. The old gathering places had been scattered across vast landscapes. Now temples and shrines began to appear near the fields themselves. Instead of traveling hundreds of miles to meet other clans, people gathered locally, reinforcing their bond with the land they worked every day. The gods or spirits became more territorial, associated with rivers, fields, and mountains that fed specific communities. Agriculture also brought storage. Grain could be harvested, dried, and kept for months or years. This was revolutionary, and not just for the stomach. Stored food meant wealth could be accumulated, and with wealth came social hierarchy. The person who controlled the granary controlled the survival of the group. In many early settlements, that person was the chief, but close behind, or sometimes ahead, was the priest. The priest was the interpreter of the skies, the one who told you when to plant and when to harvest, when to call for rain and when to give thanks for it. In the old religion, the shaman had been an intermediary with the spirit world, operating largely outside the daily control of the community. In the new agriculture-bound world, the spiritual role became institutionalized. The priesthood was born. This didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen the same way everywhere. In some places, the transition was gradual, with old rituals adapted to the new life. In others, the old ways faded quickly, replaced by a pantheon of agricultural deities whose moods determined the fate of the crops. Fertility goddesses took on new attributes, now tied explicitly to grain or soil. Sky gods who once governed the hunt, now ruled the rain and the sun. Architecture changed along with belief. In Jericho, one of the world's first known towns, massive stone walls and a tower were built not just for defense, but possibly for ceremony. In Catalhuyuk, houses doubled as shrines, their walls decorated with bull's horns and painted scenes. These were not communal monuments in distant landscapes, they were embedded in the daily life of the settlement. But agriculture also created tensions with the older worldview. Hunter-gatherer spirituality had been about movement, about a web of connections stretching across the land. Farming narrowed the focus to a fixed territory, creating a sharper us and them. The land was no longer shared seasonally, it was owned, defended, and fought over. And with ownership came the idea that the gods themselves might be partisan, favoring one group's fields over another's. This shift may be why the lost religion, once so universal in its patterns, began to fragment. Symbols and rituals that had once been shared across continents became local property. The spiral that might once have meant cycle to everyone could now mean our harvest in one village and our river in another. The serpent that once slithered through creation stories everywhere might now belong to a single temple cult. It's possible that the old ways didn't disappear entirely, they went underground, surviving in folk customs and festivals, even as official religion turned toward a more agricultural pantheon. Some later harvest rituals, like dancing in circles, burning effigies, or leaving offerings in fields, may be direct descendants of ceremonies that once honored the cycles of the wild world. From a certain angle, the rise of agriculture looks like the first great religious compromise. The vast roaming cosmology of the lost religion was reshaped to fit the narrow demands of village life. The gods became more local, the rituals more predictable, the sacred more bound to walls and fields than to the open sky. And yet, in the quiet spaces, in the festivals that still honored the turning of the seasons, in the charms buried at the edge of the fields, in the stories told by firelight on winter nights, the old religion still breathed, waiting for its next migration. By the time the first true city-states rose in Mesopotamia, the old religion had already been reshaped by farming life. But the transformation wasn't over. The scattered, many-voiced spirits of the wild, the moon that guided migrations, the serpents that guarded springs, the mother figures carved into pocket-sized charms, were about to get new jobs, new names, and in many cases, complete personality overhauls. Urban civilization needed its gods to be like its government, centralized, organized, and ranked. You can't run a city of tens of thousands with a pantheon so diffuse it includes every rock, tree, and river. So the spirits of the lost religion were gathered up, streamlined, and turned into an official cast of characters, divine rulers for human kingdoms. In summer, where cities like Uruk, Ura, and Lagash emerged around 4000–3000 BCE, this rebranding was in full swing. The sky itself became the domain of Anu, the father of gods. The waters were ruled by Enki, the storms by Enlil. Each city had its patron deity, who lived in the central temple and was treated as the city's ultimate owner. The old idea that the land belonged to everyone under the care of many spirits was gone. Now the land belonged to the god and the god belonged to the city. The goddesses fared better than you might expect, though not without changes. The fertility figures of the old religion evolved into grandmother goddesses like Ninhursag, Ishtar and Inanna. They still ruled over birth and fertility, but now they also oversaw love, war and political power. The raw, earthy nurturing of the mother of all mothers was polished into divine queenship, complete with temples, priestesses and processions. In Egypt, the transformation took a similar path. The Nile had long been sacred, its flooding tied to the rhythms of life, but now its spirit was embodied in gods like Hapi. Animal spirits from the old world were recast as divine forms. The falcon became Horus, the ibis became Thoth, the cow became Hathor. These were no longer free-roaming powers. They had temples, hierarchies, and a priestly bureaucracy to manage their worship. Even the serpent, once a universal symbol of rebirth and hidden wisdom, was split in two. In some places, like Egypt, it became a guardian, coiled around the sun god's bark. In others, it became an adversary, as in Mesopotamian myths where serpent-like creatures were enemies of order. This was the city-state rewriting the narrative. The wild and untamed, once sacred, could now be dangerous, even evil, if it didn't fit into the controlled order of urban life. One of the clearest signs of this rebranding was the way gods began to take credit for things the old religion saw as the work of the entire natural order. Rain didn't just come because it was the season. Now it was a gift from the storm god. Crops didn't grow because of the eternal cycle. They grew because the fertility goddess was pleased. This gave the priesthood enormous power. Keep the gods happy, and the city survives. Fail, and the gods punish everyone. The temples themselves reflected this new reality. In the old religion, sacred places were often open air, stone circles, hilltops, caves. Now the gods had houses, towering ziggurats in Mesopotamia, massive stone temples in Egypt, with storerooms, courtyards, and carefully guarded inner chambers where only the highest priests could enter. The gods had gone from being everywhere to being somewhere, and that somewhere was locked behind walls. And yet, if you look closely, the fingerprints of the lost religion are still there. The Mesopotamian ziggurats were built as artificial mountains, echoing the sacred hills and high places where earlier peoples met their gods. Egyptian temple reliefs show priests carrying small statues of deities out into the sunlight during festivals, a ritual not so different from carrying a sacred figure through the fields in prehistoric times. Even the myths, grand and elaborate as they became, carry traces of older beliefs. Inanna's descent into the underworld reads like an agricultural cycle. The goddess disappears. Winter, the land suffers, and she returns. Spring. The Egyptian story of Osiris, murdered, dismembered and restored, echoes the idea of death and rebirth that was carved into Venus figurines and painted on cave walls long before the first pharaoh wore a crown. But the city-states version of these myths came with a political edge. The gods weren't just cosmic forces, they were rulers, and their will was law. Worship became an act of civic duty as much as spiritual devotion. Paying taxes to the temple was no different from paying them to the palace. In many cases they were the same thing. The temple controlled land, labor and wealth, just as the gods controlled life, death and the harvest. For those who still remembered the old ways, this must have been a mixed blessing. The gods of the lost religion had been close in the river you drank from, the tree you rested under, the stone you carved your spiral into. The new gods were impressive, powerful, but also distant. You needed permission to approach them, and that permission came through the priests. In that sense, the rebranding of the old gods wasn't just about changing their names or domains. It was about moving them out of the everyday world and into a gated palace in the sky. A palace that conveniently had a branch office right in the center of town. Once the city-states took over religion, the old gods and symbols of the lost faith could have vanished completely. In many cases they did, erased from stone, replaced by official pantheons and stripped of their old names. But in other places, they didn't disappear so much as go underground. They learned how to hide. The camouflage was myth. Stories have always been harder to control than temples. A temple can be burned, a statue can be smashed. But a story lives in the mind, and the mind can carry it across deserts, over mountains, and through generations without ever writing it down. Myths became the secret vaults where pieces of the lost religion could survive, even when the surface of the story was polished to fit the new order. In Mesopotamia, for example, the official creation myth, the Enuma Elish, begins with chaos waters, personified as Tiamat, the primordial mother. She is monstrous in the city-state's telling, a threat to the new god's power. But beneath the propaganda, you can glimpse her earlier form, the great ocean mother of the lost religion, the source of all life, now rewritten as an enemy, so she could be defeated and replaced. In Greece, the Olympian gods became the headline act, but scraps of older beliefs still cling to the edges of their myths. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, loses her daughter Persephone to the underworld each year, a thinly veiled version of the ancient fertility cycle. Before she was a neatly dressed Olympian, Demeter was likely a much older Earth Mother figure, roaming the fields with none of the courtly polish the city-state gave her. Egypt tells the same story in its own way. The Osiris myth, in which the god is killed, cut into pieces and reassembled by his sister-wife Isis, is an obvious agricultural allegory. Death in the dry season, rebirth in the flooding of the Nile. But if you strip away the royal trappings, it looks strikingly like the much older tales of dying and returning vegetation spirits, celebrated in the wild long before the first pharaoh claimed divine blood. In many cultures, serpents went through the same mythic camouflage. In the old religion, they were keepers of knowledge, symbols of renewal. In the new mythologies, they could still be those things, but often with a twist. Sometimes the serpent kept its wisdom but became a test or a threat, like the guardian of a treasure in Greek stories. Other times, the serpent was pushed into the role of trickster or outright villain, as in later religious traditions. The city-state got to keep the power of the symbol while changing its meaning to suit their political or moral needs. The camouflage worked in subtler ways too. Folk tales, riddles, and proverbs sometimes preserved fragments of the old religion, in forms so humble they escaped notice. A children's story about an animal who dies and returns might be a fossilized remnant of a seasonal ritual. A saying about planting under the new moon might carry forward ancient lunar agricultural knowledge. To outsiders, or to future historians, these might look like harmless bits of culture, but to those who carried them, they were memory. The oral nature of these stories gave them flexibility. As the political climate changed, so could the telling. A god's name might be swapped out for a safer one, but the role and symbolism stayed. A sacred animal might be turned into a fairy tale helper. A holy site might become the setting for a legend about a hero's battle, with just enough detail left to keep the older associations alive. In this way, the lost religion was able to survive periods of suppression, conquest, and forced conversion. It became like a vine growing under the paving stones, invisible from above, but still alive, ready to sprout wherever a crack appeared. Sometimes it even climbed back into the open, re-emerging when political power shifted or when new religions absorbed it wholesale. One of the best examples of this re-emergence is the way seasonal festivals persisted. The ancient celebrations tied to solstices, equinoxes, and harvests didn't vanish. They simply took on new names and new patron saints or gods. In Europe, midsummer bonfires continued under Christian rule. In parts of Africa, ceremonies honoring the spirits of the land were blended with the veneration of saints. The form changed, the costumes changed, but the rhythm, the deep pulse of the lost religion stayed the same. Even in mythic history, camouflage was at work. Legendary kings and queens often inherited the attributes of earlier deities. A warrior queen might have once been a goddess of war and fertility, demoted to human status in the official story, but still larger than life in the way she was described. The same goes for legendary founders of cities who performed miraculous acts suspiciously similar to those of older gods. This layering of myth on top of myth makes the work of archaeologists and historians both frustrating and fascinating. Every time you think you've found the original, you discover it's wearing yet another mask. But perhaps that's the point. The old religion never wanted to be pinned down in one place or form. Its strength was in its adaptability, in its ability to move through time and across cultures by hiding in plain sight. By the time writing became widespread, much of the old religion had already been filtered through this process of camouflage. What we read in the earliest texts is often the city-state's edited version, not the raw original. To get closer to the source, we have to listen for the echoes, the strange details that don't fit, the characters who seem older than the world they inhabit, the symbols that keep showing up in places they don't belong. And in those echoes, faint but persistent, the lost religion still whispers. When empires rose and fell, when cities burned, and when new gods arrived with armies and taxes, the most dangerous place to keep the memory of the lost religion was in public view. The safest place was the countryside. In remote valleys, on wind-swept coasts, And deep in forests where the reach of kings and priests was more rumor than reality, old customs lingered. Here, the festivals were not written in official calendars but in the rhythm of the seasons. Here, the gods, or at least their shadows, still walked the fields. Folklore was the armor that kept them alive. Take, for example, the harvest rituals of rural Europe. Even into the 19th century, farmers in parts of Ireland, Scotland and Eastern Europe still cut the last sheaf of grain with special ceremony, sometimes weaving it into a figure called the corn mother or harvest queen. The figure might be kept in the house until the next planting, as if it held the spirit of the fields through the winter. On the surface, it was a charming custom. Underneath, it was a direct descendant of ancient fertility rites, when the life force of the land was embodied in a goddess or animal and ritually captured at harvest. In parts of the Mediterranean, spring festivals involved parading decorated branches or garlands through the village, singing songs to wake the earth from winter. These events were often rebranded under Christian saints' days, but the structure was unmistakably older. A green branch carried from house to house? That's the echo of a ritual offering to the spirit of vegetation, carried forward under new names. The same pattern appears outside Europe. In rural Japan, the Shinto practice of honoring kami, spirits of nature and ancestors, still carries traces of the animistic worldview that would be instantly recognizable to the followers of the lost religion. In farming villages, rituals to bless the rice paddies involve processions, offerings, and the symbolic invitation of the field spirit into the plants. No stone temples here, just the conviction that life comes from partnership with unseen forces. Even in regions that underwent multiple waves of conquest and conversion, rural traditions stubbornly kept older layers. In the Andes, for example, villagers still make offerings to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, by pouring chicha beer into the ground before drinking. This custom survived the Inca Empire, the Spanish conquest, and centuries of Catholic dominance. You can rename the holiday, you can repaint the church, but you can't stop someone from feeding the soil before they feed themselves. What's striking is how often these fragments hide in plain sight. A lullaby sung to a child might contain lines that once belonged to a planting chant. A fairy tale about a woman who turns into a bird might be the last surviving echo of a goddess who could cross between worlds. Even place names sometimes hold clues. Hills, springs or groves still bearing titles that hint at forgotten spirits. In many rural communities, the old religion also survived in the form of folk magic. This wasn't the sorcery of grand grimoires, but small practical charms, knots tied a certain way, herbs gathered at a specific phase of the moon, symbols scratched onto door frames. These acts rarely claimed to be religious, but they were rooted in the same worldview that the natural world is alive, responsive and connected to human fate. Seasonal boundaries were particularly potent times for these traditions. May Day, Midsummer, Harvest and Midwinter were celebrated with bonfires, dancing and feasts, all occasions where the veil between worlds was thought to thin. In medieval Europe, church authorities often tried to suppress or absorb these gatherings, condemning them as pagan or rebranding them as saint festivals. Yet they persisted because they were woven into the fabric of rural survival. These weren't just holidays, they were community anchors, marking the turning points of the year. The persistence of these customs also speaks to a practical truth. Rural life is less forgiving of abstraction. You can't afford to ignore the sun, the rain and the soil when your food depends on them. The lost religion's core, respect for cycles, reciprocity with nature, awareness of unseen forces was never really optional outside the cities. You could overlay it with official doctrine, but you couldn't uproot it without risking the harvest. Some of these traditions eventually found their way back into mainstream culture, usually stripped of their deeper meaning. Decorative maypoles in European parks, Halloween costumes, even Christmas trees, all have roots in older seasonal rites. What was once an offering to the spirits of growth becomes a quaint custom for children. What was once a protective charm becomes festive decor. But if you talk to the elders in some of these rural places, you find the meaning isn't entirely gone. A farmer might tell you the last sheaf keeps the fields happy. A shepherd might point out a certain stone on the hillside and say it's best not to disturb it. They might not call these beliefs religion, but they are living fossils of a spiritual system that predates writing. In that way, folklore has been less like a memory and more like a seed, dormant for long stretches, germinating when the conditions are right. When archaeologists or anthropologists come asking questions, these old customs can suddenly blossom into full explanation, revealing layers that have been quietly maintained for centuries. The city-states might have claimed the temples and the priesthoods, but they never fully claimed the countryside. Out there, in the slow-turning world of planting and harvest, the lost religion never had to end. It just learned how to speak softly, so it could keep speaking at all. By the time the first great empires were carving their victories into stone, the old religion was already a shadow of itself. Not gone, never gone, but reshaped, hidden, and reduced to whispers. What had once been a living web of rituals, symbols, and sacred places was now scattered across a landscape of new temples, new gods, and new laws. The old ways couldn't openly compete, so they did the next best thing. They dissolved into myth. This was not a single event, but a slow seep, a centuries-long process of transformation. Stories that had once been about the movement of the moon or the renewal of the earth were retold as heroic adventures, moral lessons, or local legends. The gods of the old religion became characters, sometimes noble, sometimes foolish, sometimes terrifying, but no longer worshipped directly. In this way, the cosmology of the lost religion, its entire understanding of the universe, began to live inside the stories people told around fires. The mother of all mothers, for example, might return as a queen who saved her people from famine. Her seasonal cycle of disappearance and return would be rewritten as a journey to a faraway land, or an escape from captivity, timed conveniently to match the harvest. The serpent, once a bringer of wisdom, might survive as a guardian of treasure in folk tales, or as a trickster who tests the hero's courage. Sometimes the old gods were simply renamed and absorbed into newer systems. In Rome, local deities from conquered regions were often declared to be versions of existing Roman gods, allowing worship to continue in a more acceptable form. In this way, a storm spirit from a hilltop shrine might become just another name for Jupiter, or a fertility goddess might be equated with Venus. On the surface, it was assimilation. Underneath, the old rituals often carried on unchanged, now performed in honor of their new divine identity. Other times, the old gods were deliberately diminished, turned into villains, demons, or mischievous spirits. In medieval Europe, for example, figures from pre-Christian belief were often recast as dangerous fairies or malevolent beings, the sort of company you wouldn't want to keep after dark. Yet these same dangerous spirits were often still petitioned for favors in rural areas, usually with offerings of food or drink, just as they had been for thousands of years. The myths became a safe house. In a time when official religion was enforced by political power, it was safer to tell a child a story than to teach them a prayer. A tale about a hero retrieving a magical object could carry embedded lessons about the turning of the seasons, the importance of certain sacred places, or the right times to plant and harvest. To an outsider, it was harmless entertainment. To those who knew, it was a map. Even the structure of myths preserved the old worldview. Many followed the same cyclical pattern as the seasons: departure, trial, death or loss, and return. This mirrored the natural rhythms on which the old religion was built: the waxing and waning moon, the migration of animals, the decay and renewal of plants. The happy ending of the hero's return was not just a satisfying conclusion. It was a ritual reminder that endings are never final. In places where literacy was rare, oral tradition kept these myths fluid. Details could be adjusted to match the teller's needs or the political climate. If an old god's name was dangerous to speak, it could be replaced with a descriptive title. If a sacred site was under threat, its location could be obscured by moving it into once upon a time. The flexibility of storytelling was one of the lost religion's greatest defenses. It could adapt without losing its essence. Of course, over time, the original meanings faded for many people. A myth about a sun god battling darkness might become just an exciting story, no longer recognized as a metaphor for the solstice. A tale about a goddess descending into the underworld might lose its agricultural context and survive only as a strange adventure. But even stripped of their original layers, these stories retained their emotional power, which is why they kept being told. Every so often, though, the mask slipped. Archaeologists digging into Bronze Age sites have found evidence of rituals that match details preserved in much later folk tales, suggesting that at least for some, the old meanings were never entirely lost. The same story could be entertainment for one listener and initiation for another. It's tempting to think of this as a loss, and in a sense it was. The living, breathing religion of the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras was gone, replaced by echoes. But there's another way to see it, as an act of survival. Myths allowed the old religion to live in plain sight, hidden in the very thing that every culture cherishes and protects: its stories. By the time modern scholars began studying mythology systematically in the 19th century, they were often astonished to find the same themes, symbols, and story structures repeated in places separated by oceans and millennia. They saw solar heroes, dying gods, serpent guardians, mother figures, and trickster spirits appearing again and again, and in those repetitions we can still glimpse the threads of the old web. The myths are not the religion itself, they are its shadow. But sometimes, a shadow tells you more than the thing casting it. The rediscovery didn't begin with a grand announcement or a sudden eureka moment. It began with small, dusty puzzles, half-buried stones, peculiar carvings, artifacts that didn't quite fit into any known civilization's timeline. In the mid-19th century, archaeology was still part treasure hunt, part gentleman's pastime, and part wild guessing. But slowly a pattern began to emerge. It started innocently enough. Farmers ploughing their fields in France and Germany kept turning up strange figurines. They weren't Greek, they weren't Roman, and they certainly weren't medieval. They were older, impossibly older. A squat, rounded woman carved from limestone here, a polished stone disc there. Most scholars didn't know what to make of them. Some thought they were children's toys. Others, with less imagination, declared them primitive attempts at art, as if the people who carved them had been in the early stages of learning to hold a chisel. Then came the caves. The late 1800s brought a wave of accidental discoveries. Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, and dozens more. Here, in the flicker of torchlight, scientists found paintings so vivid that early skeptics accused the discoverers of fraud. Bulls, horses, deer and bison leapt across the walls in motion so fluid it could have been done yesterday. The question was, who had done it tens of thousands of years ago, and why? Some argued these were simply hunting scenes, but others noticed the strange symbols, dots and handprints that accompanied the animals. Why mark a wall with a negative handprint? Or arrange dots in certain patterns? Why, in some caves, were animals painted in chambers far too deep to be casual decoration spots? As the 20th century dawned, the finds grew stranger. In Anatolia, excavations at a place later named Kut al-Höyük revealed a 9,000-year-old city with no streets, houses packed tightly together, and walls painted with elaborate scenes, not just of hunting, but of vultures carrying away headless human bodies, of geometric shapes, of towering goddesses. This wasn't random art, this was ritual space. Then came Göbekli Tepe, though its full significance wouldn't be realized until decades later. In the 1960s, a survey team in southeastern Turkey noted odd stone structures under a hill, but they assumed they were medieval graves. They left them alone. It wasn't until the 1990s that Klaus Schmidt returned, took one look at the massive T-shaped pillars carved with animals, and realized he was staring at something at least 11,000 years old, twice as old as Stonehenge, built before pottery, before cities, before agriculture. Suddenly, the old academic model, the neat timeline where religion was supposed to be a late development, began to wobble. If Göbekli Tepe was right, then monumental temples had been built by people who still lived as hunter-gatherers. In other words, religion didn't evolve from farming. Farming might have evolved because of religion. By the mid-20th century, more and more anomalies were piling up. Nabta Playa in Egypt revealed stone circles aligned to the summer solstice, older than the pyramids. Malta's megalithic temples, long dismissed as crude stone heaps, turned out to be architecturally complex, with ceremonial chambers that amplified sound in strange, almost unsettling ways. Anthropologists began to notice parallels between these prehistoric sites and the beliefs of indigenous cultures still practicing ancient traditions. Spiral carvings in Neolithic Europe echoed symbols used in Polynesia. Snake motifs from the Sahara matched myths from the Americas. It was as if fragments of the same spiritual language had been scattered across the globe. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some scholars resisted the idea of a unified ancient religion. They argued for coincidence, parallel evolution of ideas, or pure chance. But the similarities were hard to ignore. Even when there was no evidence of contact between cultures, the same elements kept showing up: the mother goddess, the serpent, the solar hero, the sacred mountain, the underworld journey. Meanwhile, the public was fascinated. By the 1970s, books with titles like Chariots of the Gods and The Dawn of Magic were flying off shelves, mixing legitimate archaeology with wild speculation. Not all of it was credible. In fact, much of it was the archaeological equivalent of gossip, but it tapped into a deep hunger. People wanted the mystery. They wanted to believe that behind every stone circle and carving lay the fingerprints of a lost global faith. Professional archaeologists, meanwhile, worked more cautiously, piecing together timelines, cross-referencing carbon dates, and trying to filter myth from material evidence. And yet, even in their most careful papers, there was an undercurrent of awe. The sheer effort required to build these sites, to carve stones weighing tons, to align them with the stars, to maintain them for centuries, spoke of a dedication that went beyond practicality. This was not casual worship. This was a worldview in stone. By the late 20th century, technology was joining the hunt. Satellite imagery revealed ancient ceremonial landscapes invisible from the ground. Radiocarbon dating pushed the origins of certain rituals back further than anyone had dared to guess. And computer modeling showed that some of the astronomical alignments at ancient sites were too precise to be accidental. It was becoming harder to dismiss the idea that something older than Egypt, older than Sumer, older than any official civilization had shaped the human imagination. But the problem was, and still is, that this something left no name, no scriptures, no surviving priesthood, only stones, symbols and stories. And yet, for the first time in thousands of years, those stones and symbols were speaking again. If you want to watch normally polite academics bare their teeth, just mention the phrase unified prehistoric religion in a conference room. The 20th century was a golden age for such arguments, papers delivered with the stiff courtesy of Victorian gentlemen, followed by private letters in which they called each other dangerous dreamers or hopeless dullards. The split was simple. One camp believed that the similarities between ancient sites were coincidental, the product of isolated communities stumbling onto similar ideas. The other camp, the troublemakers, suspected there was a shared source, a forgotten spiritual system that predated known civilizations. And between them stood a third camp, the opportunists who were willing to twist either side of the argument to get book deals, lecture tours, or TV spots. On the cautious end of the spectrum were scholars who insisted that any connection between, say, a spiral carved into a Maltese temple and one in a Neolithic Irish tomb was purely accidental. After all, one British archaeologist quipped in 1958, "It is not as if the builders of Malta and Ireland were exchanging postcards." Others leaned on the idea of psychic unity, that human brains, given similar challenges, tend to come up with similar solutions, including similar symbols. But the radicals, and there were more than a few, pushed back. They pointed to patterns too oddly specific to write off. Why did so many cultures depict a great serpent as a guardian of wisdom? Why did the mother goddess figure appear in Paleolithic figurines across Eurasia, then resurface in later myths from Greece to India? Why were solstice and equinox alignments such a recurring theme in sacred architecture? By the 1960s, anthropology departments were quietly at war. You could see it in how certain papers were reviewed. Sympathetic peers might call a controversial theory provocative, while detractors labeled the same work dangerously speculative. Academic code for this person's career is now over. Meanwhile, outside the ivory towers, the wild theories multiplied. Ancient astronaut enthusiasts argued that these similarities were the result of extraterrestrial contact. Fringe historians proposed that a lost civilization, Atlantis, Mu, or some unnamed progenitor, had seeded its religion worldwide before vanishing. And then there were the mystics, who cheerfully ignored carbon dating altogether and claimed these sites were energy centers built to channel the planet's spiritual forces. Professional archaeologists, of course, bristled at being lumped in with pyramid power pamphleteers. But privately, some admitted that even without aliens or ley lines there was something strange. For instance, why did so many sacred sites seem to be placed in landscapes with acoustic properties, echoing cliffs, resonant chambers that enhanced chanting or drumming? How did illiterate societies create architectural alignments accurate to within fractions of a degree? The 1970s and 80s brought new tensions. As radiocarbon dating and other dating methods improved, the age of certain monuments kept being pushed back, undermining tidy textbook timelines. Suddenly, the cradle of civilization wasn't quite where or when people thought it was. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey threw an especially large wrench into the works. Its discovery suggested that religion might have sparked the creation of agriculture, not the other way around. This inversion of the old model caused more than a few sleepless nights in academia. For decades, the accepted wisdom had been that once humans settled into farming, they had the stability and surplus to invent religion. Now it seemed they may have had religion first, and that belief system might have driven them to reorganize their entire way of life. Some scholars took a middle ground, suggesting that while there might not have been a single unified religion, there could have been a broad, shared set of archetypes and rituals passed along through migration, trade, and intermarriage. But even this compromise felt dangerous. If humanity's oldest stories were truly that interconnected, then much of our separate cultural history might actually be a tangled web with the same root. And the problem with tangled webs is that they're hard to map, which is frustrating for people whose careers depend on neatly labeled timelines and categories. Yet, despite the politics, the debates pushed the field forward. Comparative mythology began to take prehistoric data seriously. Archaeologists teamed up with linguists, astronomers, and even acousticians to study ancient sites from every possible angle. The result was an explosion of cross-disciplinary theories, some brilliant, some ridiculous, and many hovering in that grey space where science and speculation mingle like awkward dance partners. Of course, the public ate it up. Television specials, magazine covers, and later, internet forums turned these academic feuds into entertainment. A charismatic archaeologist could become a minor celebrity overnight if they hinted at a grand unifying theory, or a villain if they dared to call popular ideas nonsense. In the end, no clear consensus emerged. The lost religion remained just that, lost. What had been recovered were fragments, patterns, and a sense that the ancient world was far stranger and more interconnected than previously admitted. And perhaps that's why the debate still burns. Each new find has the potential to tip the balance, to confirm one side's theory, or send everyone back to the drawing board. For the archaeologists on the ground, though, the academic battles mattered less than the simple thrill of discovery. Whether or not there had been a single global faith, each carved stone, each buried altar, each figurine was a conversation across thousands of years, a reminder that the people who made them had questions, dreams, and fears not so different from ours. And somewhere, beneath the dust of time, the answer was still waiting. By the dawn of the 21st century, the hunt for the world's oldest religion had left the dusty trenches of archaeological sites and migrated into climate-controlled laboratories, digital archives, and inevitably, late-night podcasts. What had once been the domain of a few eccentric professors was now a full-blown multidisciplinary scavenger hunt involving everyone from geneticists to computer engineers. The reasoning was simple. If this belief system was truly older than all civilizations, then traces of it had to be everywhere, in our languages, our DNA, our rituals, even in the ways our brains process certain symbols. You just had to know where to look. The first wave of this modern hunt came from linguists. Those patient souls who spend decades arguing over the origin of a single word. They began comparing the oldest root words in disparate language families, hunting for terms that might hint at shared ancient concepts. The Great Mother, the Sky Father, the Underworld River. Sometimes the similarities were uncanny. A word for dawn in one proto-language mirrored the word for birth in another, separated by continents. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the remnants of a shared mythos, passed along long before those continents were home to empires. Meanwhile, geneticists were tracing human migration patterns through ancient DNA, mapping how people moved, met, and mixed over tens of thousands of years. They found that certain population bottlenecks aligned suspiciously well with the spread of particular archaeological cultures that in turn had shared architectural styles, burial customs, and symbolic motifs. If the religion had been a global phenomenon, genetics could reveal the roads it traveled. Then came the tech people. The same algorithms that recommend your next binge watch were turned loose on enormous databases of petroglyphs, figurines, and temple floor plans. Patterns emerged, visual signatures repeated across millennia and continents. A spiral carved in Neolithic Anatolia had the same ratio and curvature as one in a Bronze Age tomb in Ireland. A recurring triple-line motif appeared both on African rock walls and in pre-Columbian Andean textiles. The machine didn't care about human timelines, it simply saw the math. For field archaeologists, this was both thrilling and slightly insulting. They'd spent decades in the mud with trowels and toothbrushes, only to have a computer cheerfully point out that the rare symbol they'd found in a Nubian tomb also appeared in a Siberian petroglyph catalogued in 1973. Still, grudgingly, they admitted the algorithms were making connections no one human could have spotted in a lifetime. The hunt also spilled into anthropology and ethnography. Researchers began studying isolated tribal groups not as living fossils, an outdated and offensive concept, but as potential keepers of rituals that might have roots stretching back to the Ice Age. A fire dance in the Kalahari, a star chant in Polynesia, a healing drum rhythm in the Amazon, each could be a surviving echo of that nameless faith. Of course, sorting out what was truly ancient from what was adopted or adapted in the last few centuries was like trying to separate raindrops in a puddle. And then there were the treasure hunters, the less academic, but infinitely more enthusiastic breed, who combed satellite imagery for unmarked ruins, dove into remote caves with GoPros, or bought crates of mystery artifacts from shady middlemen in the hopes of finding something that would blow the whole field wide open. Their contributions were uneven. Some brought back genuine discoveries that forced professionals to rewrite regional histories, others brought back rusty plumbing parts and insisted they were Atlantean technology. Governments, of course, got involved, mostly to control access to sites and ensure national claims over anything valuable. This sometimes led to the absurd. A half-buried stone ring in a desert could sit untouched for decades, not because no one cared, but because two neighboring countries couldn't agree on whose sand it was in. Despite the obstacles, the momentum built. Museums began staging blockbuster exhibitions on the first religion, blending verified artifacts with speculative reconstructions. These drew massive crowds. People seemed to crave the idea that beneath all the divisions of modern faiths, there was once something shared, something primal. But there was also a cautionary note running through the hunt. The more researchers pieced together, the clearer it became that if this ancient belief system had a unifying principle, it was slippery, layered, and deeply adaptable. It had shapeshifted across eras and geographies, sometimes absorbing local deities, sometimes hiding inside seasonal festivals, sometimes dissolving entirely into new systems. That adaptability was likely why it had lasted so long, and why it was so hard to pin down. By the late 2010s, the phrase "religion with no name" had become a kind of shorthand in academic circles, both affectionate and exasperated. It acknowledged the truth. They might never recover its full form, no matter how many drones, databases, or DNA sequences they threw at the problem. At best, they could reconstruct a ghost, an outline of something vast, felt but never fully seen. And yet, the hunt continues. Grants are still written. Expeditions are still mounted. Somewhere right now, a grad student is squinting at a 12,000-year-old carving on their laptop screen, wondering if they've just spotted a missing link, or if it's just a rock that happens to look like a snake. Because if there's one thing the modern hunt has taught its participants, it's this: certainty is overrated. The thrill isn't in finding the final answer, it's in following the trail, however faint, and in the quiet, irrational hope that one day the last piece will fall into place, and the nameless faith will step out of the shadows of prehistory, if only for a moment. The site was quiet, except for the wind, the kind of low, constant breath that makes you feel as though the stones themselves are whispering. The sun was low enough to cast long shadows over the rubble, turning each fallen block into a jagged silhouette. You could almost believe the place was waiting for someone. It didn't look like much at first glance, just another half-collapsed complex, its walls eroded to knee-height, its columns lying sideways like toppled chess pieces. No sign explained what this place was, or what it had once meant. Most visitors passed it without a second glance, on their way to the bigger, better photographed ruins a few kilometers away. But if you lingered, if you crouched down and traced your fingers over the weathered carvings, you might start to notice things. A curve here that matched a fragment from a temple halfway across the world. A cluster of dots there that mirrored a star map from an entirely different continent. The spiral, of course, always the spiral, curling into itself like a question mark no one had answered in 12,000 years. Standing there, you could imagine it all alive again. The walls towering high, painted in pigments now faded to invisibility. Fires burning in great bronze bowls, sending shadows leaping across the courtyard. The smell of something sweet and resinous drifting from the altars. Figures moving through the space in deliberate rhythm. Some carrying offerings, others carrying nothing but the weight of their presence. A low chant vibrating in the chest, repeating words so old they predated writing, yet understood by everyone who heard them. That was the thing about this lost religion. It wasn't lost in the way a coin drops between sofa cushions. It had dissolved, scattered, slipped into the groundwater of human culture. Little bits of it were still out there, hiding in plain sight. In the way we light candles for the dead, in the shape of wedding rings, in the hush that falls over a room when a birth is announced, even in the odd impulse to stand in a circle when we mean to unite, and to build something high when we mean to get closer to whatever's above us. Archaeologists will tell you that the ruins can't speak. That's true, but they can nudge. They can pull at the part of your brain that doesn't care about peer-reviewed papers or dating methods. The part that recognizes without needing to be told that people once stood here believing something together. Something important enough to carve into stone, to pass to children, to carry in memory across oceans and generations. The irony is that even if someone did piece together the entire theology of this ancient faith, the prayers, the rites, the calendar, it still wouldn't be the same thing. Belief is not a set of instructions. It's a living organism, and this one died long ago. What survives are the bones, the shell, the shadow, beautiful but silent. And yet, in the ruins, silence isn't emptiness. It's a kind of space. You can fill it with your own questions. You can stand where some nameless ancestor once stood and wonder what they saw in the stars that night. You can touch the same stone and know they shaped it for reasons that mattered enough to them to spend hours in the sun carving curves into it. Some visitors leave offerings, a flower tucked between stones, a coin left in a crack, a whispered word in a language no archaeologist will ever catalogue. It's not that they've converted to an ancient religion, it's that the place still works. It still triggers that old reflex, the need to mark a spot in time and space as special, to acknowledge forces bigger than ourselves. As the light shifted and the shadows stretched further, the site became harder to photograph, but easier to imagine. The crumbling outlines stopped looking like ruins, and started looking like foundations. You could almost believe the builders had just stepped away for a moment, and if you waited long enough, they'd return and pick up where they left off. The modern hunt will go on, of course. There will always be one more dig site, one more lab analysis, one more theory published in a journal with a circulation of 300. Some of those will add pieces to the puzzle, some will send the search in circles. But maybe that's the point. The story isn't really about finding the final answer, it's about keeping the question alive. Because every time someone leans over a weathered carving in the late afternoon light and feels that strange mix of awe and familiarity, the lost religion isn't quite gone. It's flickering, briefly in the mind of whoever's standing there. And in that moment, it's as alive as it's ever going to be again. As you step away from the ruins, the wind follows for a while, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed stone. You glance back once, and the place looks different, smaller, quieter, almost ordinary. The spell has shifted, but it's still there, tucked somewhere between your ribs and your thoughts. You don't tell anyone what you felt. You can't really explain it, and even if you could, it would sound like you were making too much of nothing. But later, when you pass a building with a spiral motif carved into its doorway, or see the moon rise fat and bright over the horizon, you'll remember. Not the details. Those are for the archaeologists and the theorists. You'll remember the sensation. The weight of time pressing down and opening up all at once. The absurd, wonderful fact that thousands of years ago, someone else stood in the same wind, looked at the same sky, and felt the same urge to believe. And maybe that's the closest we'll ever get to resurrecting it. Not with temples or doctrines, but with that fleeting recognition. We've been human for a very long time, and in some ways we've always been reaching for the same thing. The ruins don't care if you call it religion, myth, or memory. They'll still be here, keeping watch, until someone else comes along and feels the pull. And maybe when they do, they'll think they've found something new. But really, they'll just be standing where you stood on the edge of a story too old to end. And that, my friends, is where our journey through the ruins ends, at least for now. We've walked across thousands of years together, sifted through stones and whispers, and followed the faint footprints of a faith older than every empire. Maybe we didn't find all the answers. Maybe that's the beauty of it. Some stories are meant to stay half in shadow, so they can keep pulling us back again and again. If you felt even a flicker of that same pull tonight, that sense of standing in two times at once, then I'd love to know, what part of this journey stayed with you? Was it the forgotten symbols, the traces in our modern rituals, or that haunting idea that belief itself never truly dies? Scroll down, leave your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation alive. Your perspective might be the piece someone else was missing. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, tap that like button, share it with someone who'd wander the ruins with you, and subscribe for more stories the world has tried to forget. Until the next one, keep your eyes open. The past is closer than it looks.